Have you ever wondered what happens to the gardens of those who can no longer tend them? Who cares for the roses when their caretaker's heart has withered? For Thomas Bennett, the answer was no one, or so he thought. Behind the drawn curtains of his grief-darkened home, he mourned his wife for 365 days, each one bleeding into the next without color or purpose. But outside, beyond the veil of his sorrow, something miraculous was happening. Every evening as twilight cast its forgiving shadows, Clara Martinez would slip into his garden with quiet determination. Her stranger with her own burden of loss, she knelt in soil that wasn't hers to nurture flowers that wouldn't bring her joy, at least not in any conventional sense. For a full year, she restored life to Eleanor Bennett's beloved garden, while its owner sat oblivious, drowning in memories just feet away. What compels a person to care for another's abandoned dreams? What invisible thread connects one broken heart to another across yards of untended grass and unspoken words? On the morning Thomas finally found the courage to part his curtains, he didn't just discover his wife's garden reborn. He found himself face to face with the mysterious gardener who had quietly honored Eleanor's memory while he couldn't. This is a story about what grows in the spaces between devastating loss and unexpected connection. About how sometimes, when we can't find our way back to the light, someone else might tend the path until we're ready to walk it again. Thomas Bennett stood motionless, coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips, as he stared at the calendar on his kitchen wall. The date was circled in red, April 17th, a full year since Eleanor had left him. A year since the doctors had used words like comfort measures and peaceful passing, as if such clinical terms could possibly contain the violent upheaval of watching his wife of 30 years disappear. The house around him was unnaturally still, curtains drawn tight against the morning light, creating a perpetual twilight that matched his internal landscape. Dust motes floated in the thin strips of sunshine that managed to infiltrate his self-imposed darkness. Thomas hadn't meant to create a mausoleum of their home, but intention had little to do with grief's architecture. He moved to the sink, dumping the cold coffee down the drain. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually finished a cup. His reflection caught in the window above the sink, a gaunt face, silver-streaked beard untrimmed, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. Eleanor would hardly recognize him now. The thought should have motivated him to at least run a comb through his hair, but instead, it merely deepened the furrow between his brows. 1 year, he whispered to the empty kitchen. The anniversary seemed to demand acknowledgement. Some ritual to mark the distance traveled from that hospital room to this moment. But what was there to celebrate? The fact that he had survived? That seemed more like failure than accomplishment. Thomas shuffled into the hallway, past the closed door of what had once been their bedroom. He hadn't slept there since Eleanor died, opting instead for the small daybed in his study. Surrounded by books, neither of them would ever read aloud. To each other again, he at least felt some connection to the life they'd shared as literature professors at the local university. His colleagues had been understanding at first. Extended leave, reduced teaching load, casseroles left silently on his porch. But as weeks turned to months, the casseroles stopped coming. The phone calls grew less frequent. Even Thomas's closest friend, Martin, had eventually respected his explicit request to be left alone, though not without protest. "You can't just disappear, Tom," Martin had said during their last conversation nearly 5 months ago. "Eleanor wouldn't want this for you." But what did Martin know about what Eleanor would want? What did anyone know about the private language of their marriage, the silent promises they'd made to each other over decades of shared breath and mingled lives? Thomas paused at the door to the sunroom, Eleanor's favorite space, where she'd spent countless hours reading and tending to the potted orchids that had long since withered from neglect. He placed his palm against the cool wood, but couldn't bring himself to turn the handle. Behind that door lay too much of her still. Instead, he continued to his study, the one room where he could breathe without her absence crushing his chest. Here, amid stacks of ungraded student papers and half-filled journals, Thomas had created a kind of purgatory, neither fully living nor completely surrendering to the pull of grief that threatened to swallow him whole. He lowered himself into his desk chair and opened his laptop, revealing dozens of unread emails. Automated reminders from the university about committee meetings he'd stopped attending. A note from his daughter in Boston checking in as she did every Sunday, despite his increasingly terse replies. Thomas closed the laptop without responding to any of them. Outside, beyond the heavy drapes that shrouded his windows, spring was arriving in Vermont. Thomas knew this only from the changing quality of the light that seeped around the edges of his curtains. Brighter, more insistent. He couldn't bear to look at Eleanor's garden, once the pride of their quiet street. Couldn't face the wild tangle it must have become in her absence, another reminder of his failure to preserve what she had loved. Thomas reached for the leather-bound journal on his desk, Eleanor's last gift to him. "For your thoughts," she'd said, her voice already thin with pain, "when I'm not here to listen." He had yet to write a single word in it. What was there to say that wouldn't sound like an accusation against the universe for taking her? What insights could possibly matter in a world where Eleanor Bennett no longer planted tulip bulbs in October or laughed at his terrible puns? Exactly 1 year since her passing, and Thomas Bennett remained locked in the darkened house they'd shared, curtains drawn against both sunshine and sympathy, convinced that there was nothing outside worth seeing and nothing inside worth saying. But then he didn't know about Clara. Clara Martinez knelt in the soft earth, carefully working a stubborn dandelion root from the soil. The evening air held the lingering warmth of an unusually mild April day, carrying the scent of newly awakened flowers and fresh mulch. This was her favorite time, the half-light when neighbors retreated indoors for dinner, and the Bennett garden became exclusively hers. For 51 weeks now, she had maintained this clandestine ritual. It had begun almost accidentally, an impulsive act of kindness that had transformed into something far more essential. Now Clara couldn't imagine her days without these twilight hours spent tending to another woman's legacy. She sat back on her heels, surveying her work with quiet satisfaction. The garden that had been a tangle of dead stalks and encroaching weeds last April now burst with color and life. Daffodils nodded their bright heads along the stone walkway, while freshly emerged hostas unfurled their leaves in the shadier corners. Eleanor Bennett's careful planning ensured that something was always in bloom from early spring through late autumn. Clara checked her watch, 7:15 p.m. She had another 45 minutes before full darkness would make gardening impossible. Gathering her tools, she moved to the rose bushes that lined the eastern fence. These had been the most challenging to resurrect, nearly dead from neglect when Clara first discovered them. She'd spent hours researching proper rose care, motivated by the small ceramic plaque nestled at their base. Eleanor's roses, plant-only joy. "I'm trying, Eleanor," Clara whispered, gently pruning a spent bloom. These one-sided conversations had become part of her routine, a way of honoring the woman she'd never met, but whose gardening journals she'd found stashed in the old potting shed last summer. The detailed notes had been invaluable in restoring the garden, but they'd also given Clara a window into Eleanor's soul, her patience, her attention to detail, her deep connection to growing things. A light flickered on in the second-floor window of the Bennett house, the only sign that Thomas Bennett still occupied the property. Clara ducked instinctively, though experience had taught her he never looked outside. In the 12 months she'd been coming here, she'd caught only the briefest glimpses of the man, a shadow passing behind a curtain, the silhouette of a slumped figure in a chair. The neighbors said he rarely left the house except for essential errands. Clara understood his isolation better than most. After losing her daughter Sophia 3 years ago, she'd retreated into her own form of seclusion, quitting her job as the art director at a prestigious landscape architecture firm in Chicago, severing ties with friends who couldn't bear the weight of her grief, eventually moving to this small Vermont town where no one knew her story. She'd purchased the modest cottage 4 doors down from the Bennett house, attracted by its manageable garden and the peaceful street. It was during her morning walks that she first noticed the Bennett property, the once magnificent garden slowly surrendering to entropy, the perpetually closed curtains, the untouched mail occasionally spilling from the box. "You need to stop this, Clara," her sister Maya insisted during their weekly phone call 2 nights ago. "It's trespassing no matter how you justify it." "He doesn't even notice," Clara had replied, "and the garden would die otherwise." "The garden isn't your responsibility. Neither is this stranger's grief." But Maya didn't understand the peculiar comfort Clara found in this secret stewardship. In nurturing Eleanor's garden, Clara had found a purpose that her grief-hollowed life had been missing. Here, with her hands in the soil that another woman had once tended, Clara felt a connection to something larger than her loss, a continuity that transcended both life and death. Rising to her feet, Clara collected her gardening tools and placed them in the old wicker basket she'd rescued from Eleanor's potting shed. Daylight was fading quickly now, casting long shadows across the revived flower beds. Soon it would be the anniversary of Eleanor's death. Clara had pieced this together from the sympathy cards she'd found stashed in the shed and the obituary she'd looked up online. As she tucked her garden shears into the basket, Clara noticed a cluster of lily bulbs beginning to emerge near the back fence, another small miracle in this space that had become her sanctuary. Eleanor's garden journals mentioned these lilies specifically. "Thomas says they remind him of our honeymoon in Maine. Plant more next year." There would be no next year for Eleanor, but Clara had honored the instruction, ordering the same variety from a specialty nursery last fall. Now they were emerging right on schedule, a testament to the persistence of life and the strange alchemy of care, given without expectation of recognition or reward. Clara took one last look at the garden before slipping through the small gap in the hedge that separated the Bennett property from the public sidewalk. The streetlights were just flickering on as she made her way home, her fingernails rimmed with soil, her heart lighter than it had been 3 hours earlier. Neither Clara nor Thomas could have possibly known that, in less than 12 hours, their careful orbits, one contained within drawn curtains, the other within the boundaries of a borrowed garden, would finally intersect, altering both their carefully constructed realities forever. Thomas woke before dawn on the anniversary of Eleanor's death, his body remembering the exact hour when the hospital had called. He lay on the daybed in his study, watching the ceiling transition from black to grey as the world outside inexorably brightened. Sleep had been fitful at best, haunted by dreams where Eleanor walked through their home touching things he'd left untended, her disappointed gaze following him. He'd promised her so many things in those final weeks, that he would be all right, that he would keep living, that he would take care of her garden, promises made in desperate moments, when saying the right words seemed more important than considering whether they could actually be kept. The garden. Thomas pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to block out the image of what must lie beyond his curtains. Eleanor's beloved sanctuary now a tangle of weeds and dead plants, a physical manifestation of his failure to honor her memory properly. Something shifted in Thomas that morning, perhaps the precise weight of one full year of grief, or perhaps simply the accumulated pressure of unresolved promises. Whatever the cause, he found himself moving with unusual purpose. He showered, for the first time in 3 days, trimmed his beard, and put on a clean sweater and trousers instead of the robe that had become his uniform. In the kitchen, he made real coffee instead of the instant kind, using the beans Eleanor had always preferred. The familiar aroma brought her presence so vividly to the room that Thomas had to grip the counter to steady himself. 1 year without her, the enormity of it, both the unbearable length and the terrifying brevity, threatened to undo his fragile composure. "I should see it," he said aloud, his voice rough from disuse. "I should see what's become of your garden, Elle. Today of all days." The thought crystallized into determination as he carried his coffee through the house to the sunroom at the back. This glass-enclosed space had been their favorite room, offering panoramic views of Eleanor's meticulously planned garden through 3 walls of windows. Thomas hadn't set foot in it since returning from the funeral. With trembling hands, he turned the handle and pushed open the door. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of sunlight that breached the room. Eleanor's reading chair still held the impression of her body, a shawl draped over one arm exactly as she'd left it. Her gardening books remained stacked on the small table beside it, a cup ring marking the spot where she'd last set her tea. Thomas moved to the wall of windows facing the backyard, his heart hammering against his ribs. With one decisive motion, he grasped the heavy drapes and pulled them open. Light flooded the room, momentarily blinding him. As his vision adjusted, Thomas stared in disbelief at the scene before him. The garden, Eleanor's garden, was alive. Neat beds of spring flowers created a tapestry of colors across the yard. The rose bushes along the eastern fence were pruned and mulched, showing the first buds of the season. The stone pathways were clear of debris, edged with emerging perennials. The Japanese maple they'd planted on their 20th anniversary stood with freshly trimmed branches, its delicate red leaves unfurling in the morning sun. It was impossible. Thomas blinked hard, certain he was hallucinating. But the vision persisted. The garden looked not just maintained, but loved, tended with the same care Eleanor had always shown it. And then he saw her. A woman knelt near Eleanor's prized peony bed, her back to the house as she carefully worked the soil around the emerging shoots. She wore faded jeans and a blue work shirt, her dark hair caught up in a loose knot. A wicker basket of tools, Eleanor's basket, sat beside her. Thomas stood frozen, coffee cup forgotten in his hand as he watched this stranger care for his wife's garden with practiced familiarity. Who was she? How long had she been coming here? The questions tumbled through his mind, colliding with confusion and an unexpected surge of something that felt dangerously like hope. Without conscious decision, Thomas found himself moving through the sunroom to the French doors that led to the garden. They stuck slightly from disuse, the sound of their opening seemingly amplified in the quiet morning air. The woman by the peonies stiffened at the noise but didn't immediately turn. Thomas saw her shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath before she slowly stood and faced him. She was younger than he'd expected. Though not young, perhaps in her early 40s, her face, free of makeup, showed the gentle weathering of someone who spent time outdoors. Dark eyes met his with an expression that mingled apprehension with quiet dignity. "You opened the curtains," she said simply, as if this explained everything. Thomas found himself unable to form words, overwhelmed by the collision of his carefully maintained isolation with this unexpected intrusion. No, transformation. The garden that should have been dead was vibrantly alive, and this unknown woman stood in it as comfortably as if she belonged there. "I'm Clara," she continued when he didn't speak. "Clara Martinez." She gestured vaguely toward the street. "I live in the blue cottage down the road." Thomas finally managed to find his voice, though it emerged rough and uncertain. "You've been taking care of Eleanor's garden?" It wasn't a question, but Clara nodded anyway. "For about a year now." She hesitated, then added softly, "Since just after the funeral." The simple statement hit Thomas with unexpected force, the acknowledgement that while he had been hiding inside his grief, life had continued around him. This woman had stepped into the void created by his retreat, preserving something precious that he had abandoned. Why? The question came out more harshly than he'd intended, edged with the complicated emotions surging through him, gratitude and shame, and a bewildering anger at having his private grief so visibly witnessed. Clara didn't flinch at his tone. She looked down at her soil-covered hands, then back at his face. "Because gardens shouldn't die just because their gardeners do," she said with quiet certainty. "Because I thought someone should remember what she created here. Because it helped me remember what matters." The morning sun illuminated her face as she spoke, and Thomas saw something in her expression that he recognized, the particular gravity of profound loss, the careful way survivors learn to carry their grief in public spaces. "I didn't think you'd mind," she added, a note of uncertainty finally entering her voice, "since you never looked outside." The simple observation, so accurate, in its assessment of his self-imposed blindness, struck Thomas with the force of revelation. He hadn't looked outside for a full year, had deliberately turned away from the world Eleanor had loved, as if doing so could somehow keep her absence less real. And yet, here was this woman, this stranger, who had seen what he couldn't bear to see. Not just the garden needing care, but perhaps something more fundamentally human in the act of tending what grief threatens to destroy. "Would you like me to leave?" Clara asked, already beginning to gather her tools, clearly reading his silence as disapproval. "No," Thomas said, surprising himself with the immediacy of his response. "No, please don't go." He stepped fully into the garden for the first time in a year, feeling the spring air against his face, smelling the rich scent of earth and growing things. I think you should tell me what you've been doing out here all this time." And with those words on the first anniversary of Eleanor's death, Thomas Bennett finally opened more than just his curtains. They sat awkwardly at the wrought iron table on the patio, two strangers connected by an invisible thread of shared purpose. Thomas had made fresh coffee, carrying out the French press and 2 mugs on a tray that hadn't been used since the last time he and Eleanor had breakfast outside. The morning sun warmed the flagstones beneath their feet, and birdsong punctuated the silence between them. "I found her gardening journals in the potting shed," Clara said, cradling her mug between soil-stained fingers. "I hope you don't mind that I read them. They helped me understand what she was trying to create here." Thomas stared at her, a complicated mix of emotions churning beneath his carefully composed expression. "I didn't know she kept journals." The admission hung in the air between them, another reminder of how completely he had withdrawn from Eleanor's world in those final months, when the cancer had confined her to their bedroom, and he had spent every moment by her side, ignoring the slow decay of their shared life beyond those 4 walls. "They're quite detailed," Clara continued, her voice gentle. "Diagrams of planting beds, notes about which varieties thrived where, little observations about the weather, or which birds visited which flowers." She paused, then added softly, "Sometimes she wrote about you." Thomas's hands tightened around his mug. "What did she say?" Clara looked directly at him, her dark eyes compassionate but unflinching. "That you could name any plant in Latin but couldn't tell a trowel from a spade. That you read poetry to her while she worked. That watching you drink your morning coffee in the garden made her happier than anything else in the world." The simple truths pierced Thomas's carefully constructed armor. He turned away, blinking rapidly against the sudden wetness in his eyes. Eleanor had always teased him about his academic approach to plants, able to discourse on their evolutionary significance, but helpless when it came to actually keeping them alive. "I've been doing it all wrong, haven't I?" he said finally, his voice barely audible over the spring breeze rustling through the maple leaves. "Shutting everything out, letting it all go to ruin." Clara shook her head. "There's no wrong way to grieve, Mr. Bennett." "Thomas," he corrected automatically. "Please, call me Thomas." "Thomas," she echoed, the name sounding strangely intimate in her mouth. "Grief isn't something you can succeed or fail at. It's just something you survive." "And you?" he asked, suddenly curious about this woman who had appointed herself guardian of his wife's garden. "What are you surviving?" The question seemed to catch Clara off guard. She set down her coffee and smoothed her hands over her thighs, leaving faint dirt smudges on her jeans. For a moment, Thomas thought she might deflect or leave entirely, but then her shoulders straightened with resolve. "My daughter, Sophia," she said, the name emerging with practiced care as if she had learned exactly how much breath to give it. 3 years ago, car accident. The stark simplicity of the statement hit Thomas with unexpected force. He recognized the economy of words, how survivors learn to distill devastating loss into digestible fragments for public consumption. "I'm so sorry," he said, the phrase feeling hollow despite its sincerity. Clara nodded, accepting his sympathy, with the weary grace of someone who had heard those words hundreds of times. She was 22, just finished college. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She loved gardens too, was studying environmental science. The revelation of Clara's own loss shifted something fundamental in Thomas's perception. She wasn't merely a trespasser or even a good Samaritan. She was a fellow traveler on the difficult road he'd been navigating alone. The garden had become a meeting point between their separate griefs. "Is that why you started taking care of Eleanor's garden?" he asked. Clara considered this, her gaze drifting over the flower beds she had rejuvenated. Not consciously, perhaps. "I moved here after Sophia died. Needed somewhere quiet to exist, I suppose. I noticed your garden dying a little more each day, and it just seemed wrong. She looked back at him. Gardens are supposed to outlive us. That's the whole point of them, isn't it? Planting something that continues. Her words resonated with something Eleanor had often said, that gardens were acts of faith, investments in a future you might not see. Thomas had always found the sentiment poetically appealing, but never fully understood it until this moment, sitting with this stranger who had preserved his wife's vision while he had been blind to it. "Would you show me what you've done?" Thomas asked suddenly. "What you've learned from Eleanor's journals?" Clara's expression brightened with surprise and what might have been pleasure. "Of course, I'd like that." For the next hour, Thomas followed Clara around the garden, listening as she explained the work she'd done over the changing seasons, which plants she'd managed to save, which ones she'd had to replace, the amendments she'd made to the soil based on Eleanor's notes. She spoke with knowledge and passion, but also with humility, always careful to credit Eleanor's original vision. The roses were the hardest, she admitted, leading him to the eastern fence where Eleanor's prized heritage varieties grew. "I almost lost them that first summer, but I found a specialist in Montpellier who helped me nurse them back." Thomas touched one of the buds, marveling at its resilience. "Eleanor spent years collecting these. Each one has a story," he pointed to a particularly robust bush with emerging deep red buds. "This one's called Remember Me. I gave it to her on our 25th anniversary." "I know," Clara said softly. She wrote about it in her journal, said it was her favorite because it bloomed even in poor conditions. She paused, then added, "I think she was really writing about you." The observation, so unexpected and yet immediately recognizable as truth, caught Thomas off guard. A laugh escaped him, rusty from disuse but genuine. "She would have liked you," he said, the words emerging before he could consider them. Clara smiled, a full expression that transformed her serious face. "I think I would have liked her too." They completed their circuit of the garden in comfortable silence, ending back at the patio where their now cold coffee awaited. The morning had warmed considerably, promising one of those perfect spring days that seemed designed to coax reluctant souls outdoors. "I should go," Clara said, glancing at her watch. "I've taken up enough of your morning." "No," Thomas said, quickly, surprising himself with his reluctance to see her leave. "I mean, thank you for everything you've done here." He gestured at the garden, vibrant with life that would not exist without her intervention. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Clara replied, gathering her tools into Eleanor's old basket. It was never about that. As she turned to leave, Thomas found himself asking, "Will you come back? Tomorrow, perhaps? There must be more to do, and I—" He faltered, uncertain how to express what he was feeling, this strange mingling of gratitude and connection that had broken through his carefully maintained isolation. Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Yes," she said finally, "there's always more to do in a garden, especially in spring." She hesitated, then added, "But only if you're sure." "I'm sure," Thomas said, with more certainty than he'd felt about anything in a year. As Clara made her way down the garden path toward the side gate, Thomas suddenly remembered something. "Wait," he called after her. "You never told me why you came this morning. You usually work in the evenings, don't you?" Clara paused, looking back at him with a small, sad smile. "It's April 17th, she said simply. "The anniversary. I thought the garden should look its best today for her, for you too if you happen to look outside." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, this stranger honoring Eleanor's memory when he had been unable to face it, moved Thomas deeply. As he watched Clara disappear through the gate, he felt something shift inside him, a crack in the protective shell he'd built around his grief. Later that evening, as twilight softened the edges of the world outside his windows now uncurtained for the first time in a year, Thomas found himself opening Eleanor's leather-bound journal. With a steady hand, he wrote the first entry, April 17th, "Today I looked outside. The garden is alive, Elle, you would be proud. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode." Thomas woke the following morning to sunlight streaming across his face. A novel sensation after months of sleeping in his perpetually darkened study. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't place where he was until the events of the previous day came flooding back. He had fallen asleep in the sunroom, Eleanor's journal open on his lap, the curtains remaining undrawn as night fell. He sat up slowly, his back protesting the awkward position he'd maintained in the reading chair. Outside, the garden glowed in the early morning light, dew sparkling on leaves and petals. Thomas stared at it, still unable to fully reconcile the vibrant scene before him with the neglected wasteland he had imagined for so long. Clara would be returning today. The thought sent an unexpected flutter of anxiety through him. What would they talk about? What did she expect from him? Would she want him to help with the gardening? The idea was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. He had never shared Eleanor's green thumb. Thomas moved through the house with unfamiliar purpose, opening curtains in each room, letting light pour into spaces that had been shadow-filled for too long. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, and he noticed with fresh eyes how neglected the house had become. Surfaces dulled with dust, mail piled haphazardly on the entry table, dishes stacked in the sink. "One thing at a time," he murmured. To himself, a phrase Eleanor had often used when he became overwhelmed by the seemingly infinite tasks of home ownership. He started with the kitchen, washing dishes and wiping counters, finding an odd comfort in these mundane chores that had seemed impossibly difficult just days before. By noon, he had cleared away the visible signs of disarray in the main living spaces and even ventured into their bedroom, Eleanor's bedroom, for the first time in months. Her scent had faded from the pillows, but traces of her remained everywhere. The novel still open on her nightstand, reading glasses perched atop it. The collection of smooth stones from their travels arranged on the dresser, her robe hanging on the back of the door. Thomas sat heavily on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted by the emotional effort of this small expedition into their shared past. He was still sitting there when the doorbell rang, jolting him back to the present. Clara stood on his porch, looking different from the previous day, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple sundress instead of work clothes, a canvas bag over one shoulder. She seemed as surprised to see him answer the door as he was to find her there. "I thought we'd be meeting in the garden," she said, a question in her tone. Thomas realized belatedly that she'd never actually been invited into his home before. "I was just..." He gestured vaguely behind him, unsure how to explain where he'd been physically and emotionally. "Would you like to come in? For tea, perhaps, before you start work?" Clara hesitated, and Thomas suddenly saw the interaction from her perspective. She had been secretly tending his garden for a year, never expecting to interact with him, and now stood uncertainly on the threshold of his grief-steeped home. "I don't have to," he added quickly. "I just thought tea would be nice," Clara said, saving him from his floundering. She followed him inside, her eyes taking in the newly brightened interior with quiet assessment. In the kitchen, Thomas busied himself with the kettle, grateful for the simple routine that required no conversation. Clara sat at the small breakfast table, her bag resting at her feet. "I brought something for you," she said as he set a steaming mug before her. She reached into the canvas bag and withdrew a leather-bound volume identical to the one he had begun writing in. "Eleanor's garden journal from last year. I thought you might want it back." Thomas accepted the journal with careful hands, opening it to find page after page of his wife's familiar handwriting, detailed notes, small sketches, pressed flowers carefully preserved between tissue paper. "I didn't know she kept these." He admitted again, the weight of all he had missed during his retreat from life settling heavily on his shoulders. "There are 3 more in the potting shed," Clara said, "going back about 5 years. They're quite thorough." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in his throat. He had known Eleanor loved her garden, but he hadn't fully appreciated the depth of her devotion to it, the careful documentation, the years of accumulated knowledge. Again, he felt the acute awareness of how much he had failed to see, even before her death. "I've been thinking," Clara continued when it became clear he couldn't respond. "The lilies will be blooming soon, and the early vegetables should be planted this week if they're going to mature properly." She hesitated, then forged ahead. Would you like me to show you how? To work together on it, I mean. The question contained more than a simple request for gardening companionship. It was an invitation back into life, a gentle nudge toward participation rather than observation. Thomas felt a flicker of panic at the prospect. He had become comfortable in his isolation, the predictable rhythm of his grief-measured days. "I'm not very good with plants," he said, stalling. "Eleanor always joked that I could kill a cactus just by looking at it." Clara smiled, a quick upward tilt of her lips. "That's why you start with something hardy, like potatoes. They're very forgiving." There was something about her matter-of-fact approach that disarmed Thomas's resistance. No pressure, no pitying looks, just a straightforward invitation to plant potatoes. "All right," he said finally, "but don't expect miracles." They spent the afternoon in the vegetable garden at the far end of the property. Clara guided Thomas through the process of preparing the soil, showing him how to test its temperature and texture, explaining why certain amendments were necessary. Her knowledge was extensive but presented without pretension, and Thomas found himself genuinely interested in the science behind what had always seemed like Eleanor's intuitive gifts. "You really know what you're doing," he observed, as Clara demonstrated how to cut seed potatoes for maximum yield. She shrugged, a shadow briefly crossing her face. "My daughter was the real expert. I learned most of this from helping with her university projects." She handed him a section of potato with 2 prominent eyes. "These will become the new plants." Amazing how life persists, isn't it? The simple observation hung between them, layered with meaning beyond the botanical. Thomas carefully placed the seed potato into the trench they had dug, covering it with the rich, dark soil. There was something profoundly satisfying about the action, this basic act of faith in future growth. They worked side by side until the late afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden. Thomas was surprised to find that his initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by a quiet rhythm of shared purpose. His back ached and his hands were filthy, but for the first time in a year, he felt the pleasant fatigue of physical effort rather than the bone-deep exhaustion of grief. As they were cleaning up their tools, Thomas noticed Clara glancing repeatedly at her watch. "Do you need to be somewhere?" he asked. "Just a standing appointment," she said vaguely. "A support group. It's not important." But Thomas caught the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her movements became more hurried. "For people who've lost children," he guessed gently. Clara paused in rinsing a trowel, her back to him. "Yes, I've been going for about 2 years now. It helps sometimes." She turned to face him, water dripping from her hands. "Do you ever consider something like that? For widowers or—" Thomas shook his head quickly. "I'm not much for group activities." The idea of sitting in a circle, sharing his grief with strangers, made his skin crawl. "Besides, I have my students." Even as he said it, he realized how long it had been since he'd actually taught a class. His department had arranged indefinite leave after Eleanor's death, and he had accepted it without protest. "Right," Clara said, clearly not believing him, but too polite to challenge the obvious fiction. She dried her hands on a towel hanging by the outdoor spigot. "Well, I should get going if I'm going to make it on time." "Of course." Thomas walked her to the garden gate, suddenly reluctant to see her leave. Would you want to come back tomorrow? There must be more to do." Clara studied him, her dark eyes unreadable in the fading light. "There's always more to do in a garden, Thomas. But maybe you should try something on your own first. Maybe look through Eleanor's journals, find a small project to tackle." The suggestion, so clearly designed to encourage his independence, both touched and terrified him. "What if I kill something important?" A genuine smile broke across Clara's face. "That's the wonderful thing about gardens. Most mistakes can be fixed." She gestured toward the newly planted potato bed. "And even when they can't, there's always next season." After she left, Thomas wandered back through the garden alone, seeing it with new awareness. Beyond the beauty Clara had restored, he began to notice the structure Eleanor had created, the thoughtful progression of heights and colors, the careful balance of sun and shade plants, the hidden corners designed for peaceful contemplation. Back in the house, Thomas opened Eleanor's recovered garden journal and began to read in earnest. Her voice emerged from the pages with such clarity that he could almost hear her speaking the words aloud. Practical observations gave way to personal reflections, and Thomas found himself laughing and weeping by turns at her candid commentary. Halfway through the journal, a pressed flower fell into his lap. A forget-me-not, its delicate blue petals perfectly preserved. Beside it, Eleanor had written, "Thomas brought me these today, picked from the woods behind the university. He doesn't know their proper name, but he said they reminded him of my eyes. After 28 years, he can still make my heart skip." Thomas touched the tiny flower with trembling fingers, a memory surfacing of that spring day. How Eleanor had smiled at his small offering, how the late afternoon sun had caught in her silver-streaked hair. He had forgotten that moment until now, one of thousands of small tenderness they had exchanged over their decades together. That night, for the first time in a year, Thomas slept in their bed, Eleanor's garden journal resting on the pillow beside him. His dreams were full of growing things and gentle hands showing him how to nurture them. The next 3 weeks established a pattern that gradually began to feel like normality to Thomas. Clara came most days around 4 o'clock, after her shift at the local plant nursery, a job Thomas discovered she had taken primarily to access specialized plants for his garden at employee discount. They would work together for a few hours, Clara guiding Thomas through the fundamentals of gardening while he shared stories about Eleanor that the various plants and garden features evoked. These exchanges had a therapeutic quality that neither acknowledged directly but both came to rely on. For Thomas, speaking Eleanor's name aloud and sharing memories of her with someone who never knew her somehow made her feel more present rather than highlighting her absence. For Clara, the careful work of tending the garden provided structure to days that might otherwise have been formless with grief. "Tell me about Sophia," Thomas said one afternoon as they knelt side by side, transplanting seedlings Clara had started at her cottage. He had been cautious about asking directly about her daughter, recognizing in Clara the same protective instinct he felt around discussions of Eleanor, the need to control when and how memories were shared. Clara's hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their gentle work. She was brilliant, stubborn, could argue circles around her professors. A smile touched her lips. She looked like her father, tall, fair, but the personality was all mine, poor kid. "Is her father—" Thomas let the question trail off, unsure of the proper phrasing. "He's in Chicago still. We divorced when Sophia was 12. Clara tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "He remarried, has 2 sons now. We don't really keep in touch except for Sophia's birthday." She glanced at Thomas. "What about your children? I noticed family photos inside." "Just one, Madeline. She's in Boston, works as an environmental lawyer." Thomas carefully placed a tomato seedling into the hole Clara had prepared. "She calls every Sunday, wants me to come visit. I keep putting her off." "Why?" Clara asked, her tone curious rather than judgmental. Thomas considered the question, realizing he had never articulated his reluctance aloud before. "She looks so much like Eleanor. Same mannerisms, same laugh. It's difficult, and I don't want to burden her with—" He gestured vaguely at himself. "All this. Your grief, you mean?" "Yes." Thomas patted soil around the seedling with perhaps more force than necessary. "She has her own life, her own family starting. Her wife is expecting their first child in the fall." Clara nodded, understanding in her expression. "Sophia's friends stopped calling after the first year. I think it was hard for them to know what to say, how to act around me." She sighed. "Grief makes people uncomfortable. It's not their fault." "It's inconvenient," Thomas agreed, surprising himself with the bitterness in his tone. "People want you to be sad for an appropriate amount of time, then move on. Get back to normal. As if there could be a normal after." Clara's voice held the same edge. They worked in silence for a while, the shared understanding between them deepening without need for further words. Thomas found himself studying Clara when she wasn't looking, the graceful economy of her movements, the serious set of her mouth that transformed completely on the rare occasions when she truly smiled. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense, But there was something compelling about her quiet intensity, her uncomplicated honesty. "I've been thinking about going back to teaching," Thomas said suddenly, the decision crystallizing even as he spoke it. "Maybe just one class to start for the summer session." Clara looked up, genuine pleasure lighting her features. "Thomas, that's wonderful. What would you teach?" 19th century British literature, probably. It's my specialty." He found himself warming to the idea now that he'd voiced it. "I've missed the students, though I'd never have admitted it before." "You should do it," Clara encouraged, her enthusiasm transparent. "When does the summer session start?" 3 weeks, Thomas replied, already mentally cataloging what he would need to do. Contact the department chair, prepare a syllabus, perhaps update some of his lecture notes. "Plenty of time," Clara said confidently. She surveyed the newly planted seedlings with satisfaction. "These should be established by then, and the irrigation system we set up yesterday will help when you're busy with classes." Her simple assumption that he could manage both teaching and gardening, that life could expand to include multiple responsibilities again, touched Thomas deeply. For so long, just getting through each day had seemed like the absolute limit of his capacity. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said, the words inadequate to express the debt he felt. Clara shook her head. "You were ready to look outside. I just happened to be there when you did." Later that evening, after Clara had gone home, Thomas sat at his desk and composed an email to his department chair requesting a return to teaching for the summer session. The act of planning for a future beyond the immediate day felt foreign but invigorating. As he typed, he found himself wondering what Clara would think of his syllabus choices, whether she enjoyed literature, what books might line her shelves at home. The realization that he was curious about her, not just grateful for her help or comfortable with her presence in the garden, but genuinely interested in knowing her as a person, came as a mild shock. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he had wanted to know more about anyone. His world had contracted so severely after Eleanor's death that even old friendships had withered from neglect. The following day brought steady spring rain, making garden work impossible. Thomas was surprised by a sharp pang of disappointment at the thought of not seeing Clara. On impulse, he sent her a text message. Their communication had thus far been limited to practical arrangements about gardening schedules, too wet for gardening. Perhaps tea instead. "I have questions about the irrigation system." The excuse was flimsy. They had covered the irrigation system thoroughly yesterday, but Thomas wasn't ready to acknowledge even to himself that he simply wanted her company. Clara's reply came quickly. "Tea sounds nice, but let's use my place for a change." 245 Maple Street. 4 p.m. Thomas found himself unaccountably nervous as he walked the short distance to Clara's cottage, sheltered from the gentle rain by an umbrella Eleanor had bought on their last trip to London. He had spent more time than usual deciding what to wear, finally settling on a sweater Madeline had given him last Christmas, still unworn until today. Clara's home was exactly as he might have imagined it, a small, well-kept cottage with a front garden that, while not as extensive as his own, showed the same attentive care. Window boxes overflowed with pansies and trailing ivy, and a handmade ceramic plaque beside the door read simply, "Grow where you are planted." She answered his knock immediately, as if she had been waiting nearby. "Come in," she said, stepping back to allow him entry. "I've just put the kettle on." Thomas followed her inside, taking in the details of her living space with interest. The cottage was modestly furnished but warm. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with a mix of gardening references and fiction. Framed botanical prints hung in careful arrangement. A well-worn sofa was piled with colorful throw pillows and a hand-knitted afghan. "You have a lovely home," he said, meaning it. Clara accepted the compliment with a nod, gesturing for him to sit at the small dining table while she prepared their tea. "It's cozy enough for just me, though I don't spend much time inside, especially in spring and summer." As she moved around the kitchen, Thomas noticed a framed photograph on the windowsill above the sink. A young woman with fair hair and Clara's dark eyes, grinning at the camera from what appeared to be a mountaintop. Thomas didn't need to ask to know it was Sophia. Clara saw his gaze and brought the photograph to the table, setting it down between them as she served the tea. That was 2 months before the accident, a research trip to Costa Rica to study cloud forest ecosystems. Her voice held pride alongside the inevitable sorrow. She'd just been accepted to a doctoral program at Berkeley. Thomas studied the young woman's face, struck by the vibrant energy captured in the image. "She has your smile," he observed quietly. "Yes," Clara agreed, touching the frame gently before returning it to its place. Everyone always said that. They drank their tea in comfortable silence, rain pattering against the windows, creating a cozy atmosphere inside. Eventually, Clara asked about his email to the university, and Thomas found himself sharing his ideas for the summer course, his mild anxieties about returning to teaching, his hopes that the students would be engaged with the material. "You'll be wonderful," Clara said with such conviction that Thomas almost believed her. "Passion for a subject is contagious, and you certainly have that." "How do you know?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "We've hardly discussed literature." "I've heard you talk about Eleanor," Clara said simply. "The way you choose words, the care you take with descriptions. You're a born teacher, Thomas. Anyone can see that." The observation, so perceptive and kindly meant, warmed him unexpectedly. They talked until the rain stopped, and afternoon faded into evening, their conversation expanding beyond gardens and grief to books they had loved, places they had traveled, small histories of their lives before loss had reshaped them. When Thomas finally rose to leave, he was surprised to find that 3 hours had passed. "I've kept you too long," he apologized, suddenly self-conscious about how much he had talked, how comfortable he had become in her space. "Not at all," Clara assured him, walking him to the door. "It was nice to have company on a rainy day." She hesitated, then added, "I have Fridays off from the nursery. If it's still too wet to garden tomorrow, perhaps you'd like to see the greenhouse at the Botanical Gardens. They have an excellent collection of rare orchids that Eleanor might have enjoyed." The invitation, their first planned outing beyond the boundaries of his garden or her cottage, felt significant in ways Thomas wasn't prepared to analyze. "I'd like that very much," he said, surprised by the simple truth of it. Walking home through the rain-washed evening, Thomas realized he was smiling, a small private expression no one else would see. For the first time in more than a year, he had spent an entire day without being ambushed by grief. Eleanor's absence was still there, a permanent alteration in the architecture of his world, but somehow it had shifted from an all-consuming void to a quiet companion, walking beside him rather than swallowing him whole. When he reached home, Thomas added a new entry to the journal he had begun keeping. May 8th, visited Clara's house today, saw a photograph of Sophia, talked about returning to teaching. "Eleanor, I think you would approve of these small steps I'm taking. They feel like a way of honoring you rather than betraying your memory." I hope that's true. The botanical garden visit marked a subtle but significant change in Thomas and Clara's relationship. Their interactions expanded beyond the boundaries of his garden, venturing into shared experiences that had nothing to do with maintaining Eleanor's legacy or managing their respective grief. They developed a routine that offered structure without rigidity, gardening together several afternoons a week, occasional outings to nurseries or garden exhibitions, quiet evenings of parallel reading in Thomas's sunroom or Clara's small living room. Thomas returned to teaching, starting with a single summer course that quickly became the highlight of his week. The students, initially curious about the professor who had vanished for a year and now returned with soil occasionally still visible beneath his fingernails, responded enthusiastically to his renewed passion for the material. Thomas found himself bringing elements of his gardening education into his literature lectures, drawing parallels between Wordsworth's nature poetry and the patient observation required for successful cultivation. One evening in early June, as they sat on Thomas's patio watching fireflies emerge in the twilight garden, Clara mentioned casually, "My support group is having a potluck on Saturday, a sort of informal gathering before some members leave for summer vacations." She kept her eyes fixed on the dancing lights, rather than looking at him. "You'd be welcome to come, if you wanted." Thomas felt an immediate tightening in his chest, the familiar anxiety that accompanied any suggestion of socializing beyond his carefully controlled interactions. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," he said carefully. "I'm not part of the group and I haven't lost a child." "It's not exclusively for parents," Clara clarified. "There are people who've lost siblings, spouses, close friends. It's more about creating space to be with others who understand that grief isn't something you get over." She finally glanced at him. "But of course, you shouldn't come if it would make you uncomfortable." Thomas recognized the gentle way she was offering him an exit, appreciating her sensitivity while feeling slightly ashamed of his instinctive resistance. "Let me think about it," he offered as a compromise. Clara nodded, returning her gaze to the garden. "Maya will be there, my sister. She's been asking to meet you." "You've told your sister about me?" Thomas asked, surprised and oddly pleased. "Of course," Clara said with a small smile. "You're a significant part of my life now." She was concerned at first, thought I was becoming too involved in a stranger's garden, but I've explained how things have evolved. "A significant part of my life." The phrase repeated in Thomas's mind, prompting both warmth and unease. When had that happened? How had this woman, initially a trespasser in his garden, become so integral to his daily existence? The question lingered as he prepared for bed that night, and he found himself reaching for Eleanor's photograph on the nightstand, a habit he had gradually abandoned over the past months. "What would you think of all this, Elle?" he asked the smiling image. "Clara, the garden, the way things are changing?" No answer came, of course, but as Thomas drifted towards sleep, he felt a certainty that Eleanor would have approved of the gradual reawakening of his interest in the world. She had always been the one to push him toward new experiences, to prevent him from retreating too deeply into books and academic isolation. Saturday arrived with perfect early summer weather, clear skies, mild temperatures, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly mown grass. Thomas stood before his closet, debating what to wear to a gathering of strangers connected only by their experiences of loss. The decision to attend had come gradually, aided by a gentle text from Clara the previous evening. "No pressure about tomorrow, but it would be nice to have you there. 2 p.m. if you decide to come. I'm making Eleanor's strawberry rhubarb pie from the recipe in her kitchen notebook." The mention of Eleanor's recipe, one Clara must have discovered during her early, careful explorations of his home, settled something in Thomas. There was something right about bringing Eleanor's pie to this gathering, a way of honoring her memory through sharing rather than hoarding it in solitude. Clara's face lit with genuine pleasure when she opened her door to find Thomas on her porch at 1:30, a bottle of wine in hand. "You came," she said simply. "I came," he agreed, surprised by how natural it felt to be standing there. "Can I help carry anything?" The support group gathering was held in a community garden on the edge of town, a fitting location that immediately eased some of Thomas's tension. Approximately 20 people had assembled, ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, all engaged in the casual rituals of a potluck, arranging dishes, setting up folding chairs, greeting one another with the comfortable familiarity of shared experience. Clara led Thomas to a woman who could only be her sister. The resemblance was striking, though Maya was slightly taller and wore her dark hair much shorter. "Maya, this is Thomas. Thomas, my sister Maya." "The garden man," Maya said, her handshake firm and her assessment direct. "I've heard a lot about you." "Likewise," Thomas replied, though in truth Clara had mentioned her sister only occasionally. He could feel Maya's protective scrutiny and understood it. If their positions were reversed, wouldn't he too be concerned about Madeline forming a close friendship with someone defined primarily by their grief? "Clara tells me you've gone back to teaching," Maya said as they helped set up the buffet table. 19th century literature? "Yes," Thomas confirmed, relaxing slightly at the safe topic. "Just one course for the summer, but I'm considering a full schedule for fall." "That's good," Maya said with apparent approval. "Clara mentioned your garden is thriving too." "That's entirely Clara's doing," Thomas insisted. "I'm just the apprentice." Maya's expression softened slightly. "Don't underestimate your role. Having a purpose again has been good for her. Before you, it was all sorrow and survivor's guilt." The candid assessment surprised Thomas. Survivor's guilt? Maya glanced over to where Clara was chatting with an elderly couple across the garden. She was supposed to drive Sophia to the airport that day, but got called into an emergency client meeting. Sophia took a taxi instead. The accident happened on the highway. She looked back at Thomas, her gaze direct. Clara couldn't work after that. Kept thinking if she'd just prioritized differently, been there for her daughter instead of her job, everything would be different. The revelation of this additional layer to Clara's grief hit Thomas with unexpected force. He had known, of course, that she carried profound sorrow over her daughter's death, but he hadn't realized she also shouldered this burden of perceived responsibility. It explained so much about her dedication to his garden, the careful attention, the consistent presence, the commitment to nurturing what had been abandoned. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "She wouldn't have told you," Maya replied with a small shrug. Clara protects people from the uglier sides of her pain, always has. She fixed Thomas with a pointed look. "Which is why I'm telling you. She cares about you, Professor Bennett, more than she's probably admitted to herself." Before Thomas could formulate a response to this startling statement, Clara rejoined them, carrying a tray of lemonade glasses. "Are you interrogating Thomas already, Maya?" she asked lightly, though Thomas detected a note of genuine concern. "Just getting acquainted," Maya assured her with an innocent smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was about to ask about his daughter in Boston." The remainder of the afternoon unfolded more easily than Thomas had anticipated. The support group members welcomed him without pressing for his story, seemingly content to include him in their community without requiring credentials of grief. They ate at picnic tables scattered throughout the garden, conversations flowing naturally between serious topics and light-hearted reminiscences. Thomas observed Clara in this setting with newfound awareness. She moved among the group with quiet confidence, clearly a respected and valued member. Several times he caught her in moments of deep connection with others, holding the hand of a tearful young man, listening intently to an older woman's story, laughing genuinely at a shared memory of someone gone but not forgotten. "Your Eleanor's strawberry rhubarb pie is the hit of the potluck," said a voice beside him. Thomas turned to find a man about his age settling onto the bench next to him. "I'm Howard. Lost my partner, James, 3 years ago. Cancer." "Thomas. My wife, Eleanor. Cancer as well." The abbreviated introduction came more easily than Thomas would have expected, the shorthand familiar in this unique gathering. Howard nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your first time at one of these events?" "Is it that obvious?" "You have that look, part deer in headlights, part surprised relief." Howard smiled slightly. "I wore it myself for months." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the interactions around them. Finally, Howard said, "Clara speaks highly of you, says you're helping each other heal through gardening." "She's done far more for me than I have for her," Thomas admitted. Howard considered this. "Maybe, but healing isn't a competition, and sometimes the greatest gift is simply allowing someone else to help you." He glanced at Thomas. "It took me 2 years to let friends bring me groceries without feeling like I was failing James by not managing on my own." The observation struck Thomas with unexpected clarity. He had been thinking of his relationship with Clara primarily in terms of what she had done for him. Saved Eleanor's garden, drawn him back into the world, provided companionship during his emergence from isolation. But perhaps his willingness to accept her help, to let her tend what Eleanor had loved, had been its own kind of gift. "How do you do it?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Balance remembering them with continuing?" Howard didn't answer immediately, his gaze distant. "James loved to cook," he said finally. "Elaborate meals, always trying new recipes. After he died, I lived on frozen dinners for months. Couldn't bear to use the kitchen." He smiled faintly. "Now I cook almost every day. Not as well as he did, but I'm learning. Each time it feels like both remembrance and moving forward. Like tending Eleanor's garden," Thomas thought, a way of honoring what was lost while still participating in what remained. As the gathering began to disperse in the early evening, Thomas found himself exchanging phone numbers with Howard and making tentative plans to attend a poetry reading the following week. The casual arrangement would have been unthinkable even a month ago, yet now it felt like a natural extension of his gradually expanding world. Clara appeared beside him as he was helping fold chairs, her expression quietly pleased. "You survived," she observed. "More than survived," Thomas acknowledged. "It was healing, actually. Thank you for encouraging me to come." Together they packed up the remaining food and loaded it into Clara's car. The summer evening was mellowing toward dusk, the air still warm but softened with approaching night. "Would you like to walk home?" Clara suggested. "It's only about a mile and the route through the park is lovely this time of day." Thomas agreed readily, and they set off at a leisurely pace, their conversation flowing easily between reflections on the gathering and observations about the gardens they passed. As they crossed the park, Clara's hand occasionally brushed against his accidental touches that nevertheless sent small currents of awareness through Thomas. "Maya likes you," Clara said as they neared her cottage. "She's protective, but she can see that you're—" She hesitated, seemingly searching for the right word. "Harmless?" Thomas suggested with a small smile. "Genuine," Clara corrected firmly. "There's no pretense with you, Thomas. It's refreshing." They paused at her gate, the moment weighted with unspoken possibilities. Thomas found himself noticing details of Clara's appearance with unusual acuity, the way the evening light caught the silver strands in her dark hair, the fine laugh lines at the corners of her eyes, the natural grace of her posture. "Would you like to come in for tea?" she asked, a slight hesitation in her voice that hadn't been present in previous similar invitations. Thomas recognized the subtle shift in her question. Not just tea, but something more, a door opening to possibilities neither of them had acknowledged directly. For a moment, panic fluttered in his chest. Was he ready for whatever might lie? Beyond that threshold? Was it a betrayal of Eleanor to even consider it? "Not tonight, I think," he said gently, watching as Clara's expression carefully settled into neutral acceptance. "I have final papers to grade. Rain check?" "Of course," Clara replied, her smile genuine if slightly reserved. "Thank you for coming today. I know it wasn't easy." On impulse, Thomas leaned forward and kissed her cheek, a brief, warm contact that surprised them both. "Thank you for inviting me," he said simply, then turned and continued walking toward his own home before he could second-guess the gesture. That night, Thomas sat in Eleanor's garden, their garden now, perhaps even his and Clara's garden in some evolving way, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider what Eleanor would truly want for him, not as a theoretical exercise, but as an honest question deserving of a thoughtful answer. "You always said life was for the living, Elle," he whispered to the night air. "Is it all right to take that seriously now? To see where this might lead?" No dramatic sign appeared in response, just the gentle rustle of leaves in the summer breeze and the distant call of a mourning dove. Yet Thomas felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, the beginning of permission, not from Eleanor, who was beyond such concerns, but from himself. Back inside, he added a new entry to his journal. June 18th, attended Clara's support group today. Met her sister and some remarkable people finding their way forward after devastating losses. I think I'm starting to understand what Clara meant about gardens, how they're always about both remembrance and continuation. The plants Eleanor loved still bloom, but new ones join them. The design she created remains, but evolves with each season. Perhaps lives can be like that too. The gentle rhythm of summer continued, with Thomas and Clara spending most afternoons together, either in the garden or exploring nearby gardens and nurseries. Thomas expanded his teaching load to 2 courses, finding renewed purpose in his work. Clara reduced her hours at the plant nursery, using the extra time to restart her landscape design business with a small local clientele. Their relationship evolved with unspoken understanding. Shared meals became more frequent, casual touches more natural, the boundaries between their separate lives increasingly permeable. Neither put a name to the gradual transformation from friendship to something more, but both recognized its significance through small adjustments in behavior. Thomas keeping Clara's favorite tea stocked in his kitchen, Clara leaving a spare sweater hanging in his hallway for cool evening gardening sessions. In late July, Thomas's daughter Madeline announced she would be visiting the following weekend, her first trip home since Eleanor's funeral. The news elicited a complex mix of emotions for Thomas: joy at seeing his daughter, anxiety about how she would perceive the changes in his life, uncertainty about how to introduce Clara. "You're overthinking this," Clara assured him as they deadheaded roses one evening 3 days before Madeline's arrival. "She'll be happy to see you doing better." "It's more complicated than that," Thomas insisted, carefully snipping a spent bloom. Madeline and Eleanor were incredibly close. She might see any changes as somehow disloyal. Clara paused in her work, studying him with gentle directness. "By changes, you mean me." It was the closest either had come to directly acknowledging the shifting nature of their relationship. Thomas felt his cheeks warm slightly. "Yes," he admitted. "You've become very important to me, Clara. I want Madeline to understand that, but I don't want her to think I'm forgetting her mother." "Do you think you're forgetting Eleanor?" Clara asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. "No," Thomas answered without hesitation. "That's not possible. But I've started to think of her differently, as part of my past that shapes my present rather than as the sole focus of my present and future." He looked directly at Clara. "And you've been instrumental in that shift." Clara nodded, accepting this assessment with characteristic straightforwardness. "Why don't I make myself scarce during her visit? Give you space to reconnect without complications." The offer was generous and entirely in character for Clara, who had never pushed Thomas beyond what he was ready for. Yet Thomas found himself shaking his head. "No, I'd like you to meet her. Perhaps not immediately, but before she leaves. You're part of my life now, Clara. An important part." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, significant in its acknowledgement of their evolving connection. Clara's expression softened, a smile touching her lips. "All right then, just let me know when you're ready for that introduction." Madeline arrived on Friday afternoon, her pregnant belly more pronounced than Thomas had expected. She embraced him with fierce affection in the driveway, then pulled back to study his face. "You look good, Dad," she said, genuine pleasure in her tone. "Really good." "You sound surprised," Thomas observed, carrying her bag into the house. "Honestly, I Madeline followed him inside, her gaze traveling around the brightened interior with evident approval. "Your last few video calls you still seemed, I don't know, remote. But something's different now." Thomas felt a momentary twinge of guilt. Had he been so transparent in his emotional absence? "I've been doing better," he acknowledged simply. "Back to teaching, getting out more." Madeline wandered into the sunroom, her attention immediately drawn to the flourishing garden beyond the windows. "Oh my God, Dad," she breathed, pressing her hands against the glass. "Mom's garden. It's beautiful. I thought for sure it would." "Bash," she trailed off, clearly not wanting to voice her assumption that he would have neglected Eleanor's beloved project. "It should have been," Thomas admitted, joining her at the window. "For months, I couldn't even look outside. Kept all the curtains drawn." Madeline turned to him, confusion evident. "But then how—" "That's something of a story," Thomas said, a small smile playing at his lips. "Why don't you get settled and I'll tell you over dinner." Later, seated at the dining table, Eleanor had always decorated with fresh flowers from her garden, a pea. Tradition, Thomas had continued, tonight featuring a simple arrangement of late summer blooms. Thomas explained about Clara. He started with her clandestine care of the garden during his year of isolation, continued through their chance meeting, when he finally opened the curtains, and concluded with a carefully edited account of their developing friendship over the past few months. Madeline listened with increasing astonishment. "Let me get this straight," she said when he finished. "For a year, this woman, a complete stranger, secretly maintained Mum's garden while you hid inside with the curtains drawn, and now you're friends?" Put that way, it did sound rather extraordinary. "It's been a gradual process," Thomas said defensively. "She understood what the garden meant to your mother, wanted to preserve it, and later when we met, She understood what I was going through in a way that most people couldn't. Because she lost her daughter, Madeline said, her hand unconsciously moving to her pregnant belly in that protective gesture expectant mothers often develop. Yes. Thomas hesitated, then added, Clara's been instrumental in helping me find my way back to life, Maddie. Not just with the garden, but with everything. Madeline studied him thoughtfully, her expression, so like Eleanor's when she was processing something unexpected, both perceptive and reserved. You care about her, she said finally. It wasn't a question. I do, Thomas acknowledged, relief washing through him at being able to say it aloud to someone who mattered. As more than a friend? Thomas felt his cheeks warm slightly. It's, say, evolving, he admitted. Nothing has been stated explicitly, but yes, I believe we're moving in that direction. Madeline was quiet for a long moment, absently tracing the rim of her water glass with one finger. Mom would be glad, she said finally, looking up to meet his gaze directly. She worried about you being alone, you know, made me promise to drag you out of your shell if you retreated too far. She did. Thomas hadn't known this, though it certainly sounded like something Eleanor would do. Of course she did. She knew you, Dad, better than anyone. Madeline reached across the table to squeeze his hand. I'd like to meet her, Clara. Tomorrow, maybe? Thomas felt a wave of gratitude for his daughter's understanding. I'd like that very much. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. Casual drinks in Thomas's garden, where both women would feel connected to their respective histories. Thomas found himself unexpectedly nervous as he prepared, rearranging furniture on the patio multiple times and fussing over which wine to serve. Dad, relax, Madeline said with affectionate exasperation. You're acting like you're introducing me to your high school prom date. The observation made Thomas laugh, releasing some of his tension. I'm being ridiculous, aren't I? A little, Madeline agreed with a smile. But it's nice to see you caring this much about someone again. Clara arrived precisely on time, bearing a small pot of rare alpine strawberries that she had mentioned to Thomas weeks earlier. She was dressed simply but elegantly, in a sundress he hadn't seen before, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual gardening bun. The initial introductions were slightly awkward, both women clearly assessing each other while maintaining polite smiles. Thomas poured wine, sparkling water for pregnant Madeline, and retreated slightly, allowing them space to establish their own connection. Dad tells me you're a landscape designer, Madeline said as they settled into garden chairs. Did you study horticulture formally? Originally architecture, Clara replied. Then specialized in landscape design through apprenticeship rather than academic programs. I prefer the hands-on approach. That explains the structure of what you've done here, Madeline gestured at the garden around them. You've maintained Mom's vision, but enhanced the architectural elements. Thomas observed with growing relief as the conversation flowed easily between gardens. Madeline's environmental law practice and Clara's previous work designing sustainable urban green spaces. Both women were intelligent and passionate about their respective fields, finding common ground despite their different approaches. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas found himself increasingly content to listen rather than participate, watching the animated exchange between two of the most important women in his life, one connecting him to his past with Eleanor, the other potentially to his future. The pleasant atmosphere was interrupted when Clara's phone chimed with a text message. She glanced at it, her expression immediately shifting to concern. I'm sorry, she said, rising abruptly. I need to take this. She stepped away to the far end of the garden, her posture tense as she made a phone call. Thomas and Madeline exchanged questioning glances, but continued their conversation, giving Clara privacy. When she returned several minutes later, her face was pale, her composure visibly strained. I'm so sorry, but I need to go, she said, gathering her purse. Family emergency. Is it Maya? Thomas asked, immediately concerned. Clara shook her head. No, my ex-husband David. He's in the hospital in Chicago. Heart attack. She met Thomas's worried gaze. I need to go there. Sophia's things. There are decisions to make about the house. Maya's booking me on the next flight. Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Of course. Can I drive you? Home help you pack? That would be helpful, yes, Clara admitted, her usual self-sufficiency temporarily compromised by shock. Madeline immediately stepped forward. Go, Dad. I'll clean up here. Just let me know if there's anything I can do to help. The drive to Clara's cottage was silent. Clara staring out the window with unseeing eyes, clearly already mentally preparing for the difficult journey ahead. At her home, Thomas sat in her small living room while she moved efficiently through the space, packing essentials into a carry-on bag. How serious is it? Thomas finally asked, as she emerged from the bedroom with her packed bag. Critical, Clara replied, her voice steady but strained. They don't know if he'll make it through the night, and even if he does, she trailed off, then continued with visible effort. David never updated his will after Sophia died. Legally, I'm still his next of kin, despite the divorce. There's the house to consider, Sophia's childhood home, her things that we stored in the attic when she went to college. The implications were clear. If David died, Clara would face not only the emotional burden of losing her last connection to her daughter's childhood, but also the practical responsibilities of managing his estate. Even if he survived, difficult conversations about Sophia's legacy would be necessary. How long will you be gone? Thomas asked, the question revealing more of his anxiety than he'd intended. Clara paused in her preparations, her expression softening as she looked at him. I don't know, she admitted. At least a week, probably longer. I'll take care of things here, Thomas assured her. Your houseplants, mail, don't worry about any of that. It's August, Clara said, practical even in crisis. The garden will need daily watering if there's no rain, the new seedlings in the vegetable patch especially. I remember what you taught me, Thomas said with a small smile. I won't let Eleanor's garden suffer while you're gone. Clara's eyes suddenly filled with tears, the first real crack in her composed facade. I'm sorry about this, she whispered. The timing is terrible. With Madeline here, and everything just starting to... Thomas crossed the room and took her, hands in his. Don't apologize, family comes first, always. Even ex-family? Clara asked, attempting a weak smile. He's Sophia's father, Thomas said simply. That makes him family forever, regardless of divorce papers. Clara nodded, gratitude in her expression. She squeezed his hands, then gently pulled away to continue her preparations. Thomas watched her move around the cottage with efficient purpose, reminded of how capable she was, how accustomed to handling crises alone. I can drive you to the airport, he offered as she finished her packing. Maya's already on her way, Clara replied, checking her watch. She should be here in about 10 minutes. She hesitated, then added, It might be better this way. I'm not good at goodbyes. The statement hung between them, loaded with more significance than the immediate situation warranted. Thomas felt a flutter of unease, sensing something left unsaid in Clara's careful preparations. When Maya's car pulled up outside, Clara shouldered her bag and moved toward the door. Thomas followed, suddenly reluctant, to let her go without some more definitive exchange. Clara, he said as she stepped onto the porch, call me when you land, let me know how things are. She turned back to him, her expression unreadable in the afternoon shadows. Of course. And then, with a sudden decisiveness, she set down her bag and stepped close to him, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. Thomas, she said softly, whatever happens in Chicago, know that meeting you, knowing you, has been a gift I never expected. Before he could respond, she leaned forward and kissed him. Not on the cheek as he had once kissed her, but fully on the lips, a brief but unmistakable declaration of feeling. Then she was gone, hurrying down the path to Maya's waiting car, leaving Thomas standing on her porch with the lingering warmth of her lips on his and an inexplicable sense of foreboding. That evening, as he explained the situation to Madeline, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted, that Clara's abrupt departure marked not just a temporary absence, but a potential turning point in their carefully constructed relationship. She'll be back, Dad, Madeline assured him, misreading his concern as simple worry about Clara's ex-husband. From what you've told me, she has roots here now, with you. Thomas nodded, not wanting to voice his deeper anxiety that Clara's Roots in this small Vermont town were far shallower than his own, that Chicago represented not just her past, but potentially her future, a return to the place where her most profound connections remained. Later, after Madeline had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone in Eleanor's garden, their garden, his and Clara's garden, and tried to make sense of the complicated emotions coursing through him. For so long, his world had been defined by Eleanor's absence. Now he found himself equally unsettled by Clara's. August 12th, Clara left for Chicago today. Her ex-husband had a heart attack. I find myself unreasonably anxious about her return, as if this sudden departure might erase all the careful progress we've made together. Eleanor, is it always this complicated, starting over? Did you know it would be when you made Madeline? Promised to pull me out of my shell? The first 3 days of Clara's absence passed in constant communication, text messages updating Thomas on David's condition, critical but stable, phone calls discussing practical matters about her cottage and his garden, even a video chat where she showed him the Chicago skyline from her hotel room window. Thomas found himself grateful for modern technology that allowed this connection across distance, even as he missed her physical presence in his daily routine. Madeline observed his frequent checking of his phone with knowing eyes, but said little, focusing instead on helping Thomas maintain Clara's careful gardening schedule and sharing memories of Eleanor as they worked together in the spaces she had created. Their shared project became a bridge between them, healing rifts that had formed during Thomas's year of isolation. I should have visited sooner, Madeline admitted on her last evening as they sat on the patio watching fireflies emerge in the twilight garden. After the funeral, when you shut down, I shouldn't have let you push me away. No, Thomas said firmly. You did exactly right, Maddie. You had your own grief to process, your own life to maintain, and I wasn't in a place to receive help then. He reached over to squeeze her hand. Besides, look how well it worked out. If you'd forced me to engage, I might never have met Clara. Madeline smiled, but her expression remained thoughtful. You really care about her, don't you? I do, Thomas acknowledged, the simple admission coming more easily now. More than I expected to care about anyone again. Have you told her that? Thomas sighed, watching a firefly trace a luminous path across the darkening garden. Not explicitly. We've been careful with each other, moving slowly. Sometimes too slowly is just another form of fear, Dad, Madeline observed gently. The insight lingered with Thomas long after Madeline departed for Boston the following morning. Had he been allowing fear to dictate the pace of his relationship with Clara? Protecting himself from potential hurt by maintaining careful distances, just as he had done by keeping his curtains closed for a full year after Eleanor's death. By the 5th day of Clara's absence, a subtle shift occurred in their communication pattern. Her messages became less frequent, shorter, focused primarily on practical updates about David's improving condition rather than personal reflections. When Thomas called in the evening, she sounded distracted, their conversation punctuated by long pauses and abbreviated responses. Is everything all right? He finally asked directly. Beyond David's health, I mean. The line was silent for so long that Thomas thought they might have been disconnected. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice carefully controlled. Being back in Chicago is complicated. There are matters with David's house, Sophia's things, legal considerations about the estate. Of course, Thomas said, trying to sound supportive rather than anxious. Take whatever time you need. The garden and I will be here when you return. Another lengthy pause. Thomas, Clara said finally, I need to tell you something. David's asking me to stay, not permanently, but for several weeks at least, possibly months. He's going to need care during recovery, and there are decisions about the house that can't be made quickly. The request seemed reasonable enough on its face, yet Thomas detected something more in Clara's tone, a hesitation, perhaps even a subtle withdrawal. And you're considering it, he asked, striving to keep his voice neutral. I am, Clara admitted. Being here, in the place where Sophia grew up, it's stirring up a lot, and David has no one else. His second wife left last year, and his parents are too elderly to help. I understand, Thomas said, though a cold knot was forming in his stomach. Family obligations come first. Yes, Clara agreed too quickly. Exactly. The conversation ended soon after, with promises to talk again the following day. Thomas sat in his study for a long time afterward, staring at the silent phone and trying to interpret what had really been communicated beyond the words themselves. Something had changed in Clara's demeanor, a pulling back that he couldn't quite identify but distinctly felt. The next day's call never came. Instead, a text message arrived around noon. "Sorry, busy day with lawyers and doctors. We'll try to call tomorrow." Thomas sent a brief acknowledgement, then busied himself with garden tasks that Clara had outlined before her departure. The physical labor provided temporary distraction, but his mind kept returning to their strange, strained conversation and the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted. 3 more days passed with only sporadic, increasingly impersonal text exchanges. Thomas found himself oscillating between worry that something had happened to Clara and the creeping suspicion that she was deliberately creating distance between them. By the 10th day of her absence, with no clear return date established, he finally texted Maya. "Haven't heard much from Clara lately. Is everything okay with David?" Maya's response came quickly. "David's recovering well, moving to rehab facility. Next week. Clara's dealing with a lot of Sophia stuff from the house. Emotional time, give her space." The advice was both reasonable and concerning. Thomas had always respected Clara's need for independence, her careful boundaries around her deepest grief. Yet something about this particular withdrawal felt different, not a temporary retreat for processing, but a more permanent recalibration of their relationship. That evening, Thomas sat in Eleanor's garden as dusk settled, surrounded by the plants that Clara had rescued and the new additions they had selected together. For the first time in months, he found himself speaking directly to Eleanor, as if she were sitting beside him. "I think I'm losing her, Elle," he said softly to the evening air, "and I don't even know why. Or if I'm imagining it." No answer came, of course, but the act of articulating his fear aloud clarified something for Thomas. He wasn't willing to lose Clara without understanding what had changed. If she needed space, he would respect that. If she had decided their relationship couldn't progress beyond friendship, he would accept it. But the ambiguity of their current situation was becoming unbearable. With sudden resolve, Thomas went inside and booked a flight to Chicago for the following morning. He would not appear unannounced at David's home. That would be an invasion of Clara's privacy and potentially disruptive to David's recovery. But he could go to Chicago, check into a hotel, and ask Clara to meet him. One conversation, face to understand where they stood. The decision made, Thomas composed a careful text. "I've booked a flight to Chicago tomorrow. Would like to see you, even briefly, if possible. No pressure, just want to talk. Let me know if this is okay." Clara's response didn't come until he was already in bed, nearly asleep. "Not necessary to come. Things very complicated here. Will explain when I return to Vermont. Please understand." The message confirmed Thomas's worst fears, while simultaneously increasing his determination. He responded simply, "I understand you're dealing with a lot. Flight already booked. I'll be at the Palmer House Hotel starting tomorrow afternoon. If you can meet, wonderful. If not, I understand." Morning brought no further communication from Clara. Thomas packed lightly, left detailed watering instructions for his neighbor, and drove to the airport with a mixture of determination and trepidation. As the plane lifted into the clear Vermont sky, he found himself wondering if he was making a terrible mistake, pursuing someone who was clearly creating distance. Yet the alternative, letting Clara simply fade from his life without understanding why, seemed worse. Chicago greeted Thomas with oppressive August heat and humidity, a sharp contrast to Vermont's milder summer. The taxi ride from O'Hare to his downtown hotel provided a tour of urban congestion that made Thomas appreciate anew the quiet pace of his small town. By the time he checked into his room at the historic Palmer House, he was sweaty, tired, and increasingly doubtful about his impulsive journey. No message from Clara awaited him. Thomas showered, changed, and spent the afternoon alternating between watching the door and staring out his window at the Chicago cityscape. Evening came with no word, and he finally ordered room service rather than venturing out alone into the unfamiliar city. Just as Thomas was preparing for bed, resigned to waiting until morning to try contacting Clara again, his phone chimed with a text message. "I'm in the lobby." Heart suddenly racing, Thomas quickly pulled on proper clothes and took the elevator. Down. The Palmer House lobby was grand and busy even at this late hour, its historic architecture providing a dramatic backdrop for travelers and locals alike. Thomas scanned the space, finally spotting Clara seated in a quiet corner, watching the elevator banks with obvious tension. She looked different somehow, her hair styled more formally than he was accustomed to seeing, wearing a dress rather than her usual practical clothes, makeup accentuating her features. Thomas approached slowly, giving her time to register his presence before he reached her. "Thank you for coming," he said simply, sitting in the chair opposite hers. Clara's expression was guarded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You shouldn't have come all this way, Thomas." "Probably not," he agreed, "but I needed to understand what's happening. Your messages have been increasingly distant." Clara sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "It's complicated." "Most important things are," Thomas said gently. "Talk to me, Clara. What's changed?" She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her clasped hands. When she finally looked up, Thomas was struck by the conflict evident in her expression. Being back in Chicago in Sophia's childhood home, surrounded by her things, it's brought everything back, the grief, the guilt, all of it. "I understand that," Thomas said, though he sensed there was more she wasn't saying. "David needs me," Clara continued. "He's alone, recovering from a major health crisis. The house needs to be sorted. Years of accumulated memories, Sophia's entire childhood preserved in boxes and photographs. And you feel responsible for all of it," Thomas observed, recognizing the familiar pattern of Clara taking on others' needs. "Yes." She hesitated, then added with visible effort, "But it's more than that. Being here makes me question everything. The life I've built in Vermont, the person I've become there." She finally met his gaze directly. "What's happening between us?" The last words hung in the air between them, finally acknowledging the unspoken evolution of their relationship. Thomas felt both relief at the direct address and anxiety about what might follow. "What is happening between us, Clara?" he asked, quietly. "From my perspective, we've been growing closer, building something meaningful together. Was I mistaken?" "No," Clara said quickly. "No, you weren't mistaken. But Thomas, I'm not sure if what we're building is real, or if it's just two grieving people clinging to each other in the absence of who we really want." The observation hit Thomas with unexpected force. Was that all their connection had been? A convenient mutual support system born of shared loss rather than genuine attraction? "I don't believe that's true," he said finally. "Yes, grief brought us together. But what's grown between us is about more than filling empty spaces left by Eleanor and Sophia." Clara's expression softened slightly. "Maybe, but being back here in the place where my life with Sophia happened, it's made me realize how much I've been living in a kind of dream in Vermont. A peaceful, healing dream, but not fully real." "And this is real?" Thomas gestured at the opulent hotel lobby around them. "Chicago? Your ex-husband's house filled with painful memories?" "It's part of my real history," Clara insisted. "The life I lived for decades before I met you." Thomas leaned forward, trying to understand the sudden shift in Clara's perspective. "Are you saying you want to move back here permanently?" "I don't know what I want," Clara admitted, frustration evident in her tone. "That's what I've been trying to figure out these past 2 weeks. David's asking me to stay through his recovery at least 3 months. The house needs to be sorted, decisions made about selling it or keeping it." "And you're considering it," Thomas said, the realization settling heavily in his chest. "Yes," Clara acknowledged. "I am. Which means—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "Which means whatever was beginning between us would be put on hold," Thomas finished for her, "or ended entirely." Clara didn't contradict him, her silence confirmation enough. Thomas sat back in his chair, trying to process this unexpected development. After months of gradual, careful progress toward genuine intimacy, Clara was essentially proposing to reset their relationship to distant friendship at best. "Is there someone else?" Thomas asked suddenly, the question emerging before he could consider its implications. "Here in Chicago, I mean." Clara looked genuinely surprised. "No, of course not. This isn't about another relationship." "Then what is it really about, Clara? Because I'm having trouble understanding how 2 weeks in Chicago has completely changed. Your perspective on what we've been building for months." Clara's composure finally cracked, tears filling her eyes. "It's about fear, Thomas. Being back here, seeing Sophia's room, handling her things, it's reminded me how devastating it is to lose someone you love. And what's been growing between us." She shook her head. "I don't know if I can risk that kind of loss again, ever." The honesty of her admission touched Thomas deeply. He understood her fear, had lived it himself in the year following Eleanor's death, had allowed it to keep him isolated behind drawn curtains and rigid routines. "I understand fear," he said quietly. "Better than most. But Clara, at some point we have to decide whether the possibility of joy is worth the risk of pain." "And if it's not," Clara challenged, "if the pain is too high a price, then we live half-lives," Thomas replied simply. "Safe, but incomplete." They sat in silence for several long moments, the ambient sounds of the hotel lobby washing over them, strangers' conversations, distant piano music, the gentle click of heels on marble floors. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely audible. "I need time, Thomas. Space to sort through everything I'm feeling. David needs me here, but it's more than that. I need to be here, to face these memories, to decide what kind of future I want." Thomas nodded slowly, accepting the truth of her words even as they pained him. "I understand," he said finally. "Take the time you need, Clara. I won't pressure you or make demands." "Thank you," she whispered, genuine gratitude in her expression. Thomas hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind since receiving her cryptic texts. "Will you come back to Vermont? Eventually?" Clara met his gaze, her expression a complex mixture of affection and uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted. "I truly don't know right now." The honesty hurt more than a comforting lie would have, but Thomas appreciated it nonetheless. "Thank you for meeting me tonight," he said, rising from his chair, "for being truthful about where things stand." Clara stood as well, her composure mostly restored, though her eyes remained damp. "I'm sorry about all this, Thomas. The timing, the confusion. You deserve better." "There's nothing to apologize for," Thomas assured her. "Life rarely arranges itself according to our preferred schedules." They stood awkwardly for a moment, uncertain how to conclude this meeting that felt simultaneously like a beginning and an ending. Finally, Clara stepped forward and embraced him briefly, her body warm against his for a fleeting moment before she withdrew. "Take care of the garden," she said softly, "and yourself." Thomas watched her walk across the lobby and through the revolving doors into the Chicago night, carrying with her the certainty he had come seeking, though not the answer he had hoped for. Back in his room, Thomas sat by the window looking out at the city lights, so different from the star-filled Vermont sky he had grown accustomed to sharing with Clara. He felt hollowed out, caught between understanding Clara's need for space and mourning the potential loss of a relationship that had just begun to flower. In the quiet hotel room, Thomas opened his journal and wrote, "August 23rd, Chicago is as Eleanor described it. Vibrant, overwhelming, a city of contrasts. I came here seeking answers and found instead more questions. Clara needs time, space to determine what she truly wants. I understand this intellectually, but emotionally I am back in that darkened house, curtains drawn, waiting for someone to tend what I fear might wither in the interim." Thomas returned to Vermont the following day, the journey back seeming longer and more arduous than the flight to Chicago had been. The house greeted him with empty silence, no longer the comfortable solitude he had once cultivated, but now an acute reminder of absence, both Eleanor's permanent departure and Clara's uncertain one. The garden demanded immediate attention after 2 days of August heat without watering. Thomas worked methodically through the evening, following Clara's careful instructions for each section. As he moved among the plants they had tended together, memories of Clara surfaced with painful clarity. Her focused expression while pruning roses, her delighted smile when discovering a perfectly ripe tomato, her gentle patience as she taught him the proper way to divide perennials. Days elongated into weeks as August surrendered to September. Thomas maintained both his garden and Clara's cottage with meticulous care, preserving everything exactly as she had left it, though whether for her eventual return or his own peace of mind, he couldn't have said. Their communication settled into a predictable pattern, brief weekly text exchanges that covered practical matters but avoided deeper emotional territory. David moved to outpatient rehab, making good progress. Garden doing well. First frost. Advisory next week. Covered the sensitive plants as you suggested, sorting through Sophia's college papers. Found her research on New England native plants. Thought of you. Teaching load increased to 3 courses, students responding well to garden-based literature discussions. These carefully neutral messages revealed nothing about Clara's decision-making process regarding her return to Vermont, and Thomas refrained from asking directly, honoring her request for space. Yet each exchange left him increasingly uncertain about their future. The emotional connection that had been developing between them, now suspended in a kind of limbo, neither of them seemed willing to address. In early October, as the Vermont landscape blazed with autumn colors, Thomas received an unexpected email from Maya. Thomas, Clara's birthday is next Saturday, Oct. 12. She won't mention it, but I thought you should know. She's still struggling with decisions about Chicago versus Vermont. David's much better now, less dependent on her daily help. The house is mostly sorted. I think what's keeping her there now is primarily fear, not obligation. Just thought you might want to know that. Maya. The message confirmed Thomas's growing suspicion that Clara's extended stay in Chicago was no longer primarily about David's health needs, but about her own emotional retreat. Maya's direct identification of fear as the motivating factor resonated with Thomas's own experience, how easy it was to use practical obligations as shields against difficult emotional choices. Clara's birthday. The revelation that she hadn't mentioned this significant date struck Thomas as telling. Their relationship, whatever its undefined status, should have progressed far enough for such basic personal information to be shared. That Clara had kept it from him suggested either a deliberate maintenance of distance or an assumption that their connection had already diminished to the point where such sharing was unnecessary. Neither possibility sat well with Thomas. After careful consideration, he composed a response to Maya. Thank you for letting me know about Clara's birthday. I've been respecting her need for space, but perhaps it's time for a more direct conversation. Do you think a surprise visit would be welcome or counterproductive? Maya's reply arrived the following morning. Hard to say. Clara's complicated, as you know. She talks about Vermont and you often, but freezes when I suggest visiting. Classic Clara, wanting connection but fearing it simultaneously. A surprise might force the issue for better or worse. Her choice, but if it were me, I'd want someone to make the effort. Address is 1842 Lakeview Drive if you decide to come. Thomas spent the next several days in careful deliberation, weighing the potential outcomes of another unannounced journey to Chicago. The first trip had yielded clarity but not closure, leaving him with a better understanding of Clara's conflict, but no resolution to their suspended relationship. Would a second visit help, or merely pressure her when she had explicitly asked for space? The deciding factor came unexpectedly during a literature lecture. As Thomas discussed Wordsworth's poem, The Tables Turned, with his students. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Professor Bennett, isn't Wordsworth saying that sometimes direct experience teaches us more than endless thinking and analysis, that we learn more from living than from theorizing? The observation struck Thomas with the force of revelation. For months, he had been respecting Clara's request for space, allowing her time for reflection and analysis, while perhaps what they both needed was the direct experience of confronting their fears together, rather than separately. That evening, Thomas booked a flight to Chicago for the following Friday, arriving the day before Clara's birthday, He considered informing her of his planned visit, but ultimately decided against it, not to ambush her, but to prevent the construction of the careful emotional walls she might erect if given advance notice. The autumn journey to Chicago differed markedly from his summer visit. The city appeared transformed by the season, its architectural severity softened by golden light, and the occasional tree blazing with fall color. Thomas checked into the same hotel, finding comfort in the familiar surroundings as he prepared for what might be either a reconciliation or a final parting. Saturday morning, Clara's birthday, dawned clear and crisp, the Lake Michigan breeze carrying the first hints of winter's approach. Thomas had arranged for flowers to be delivered to his room. Not a formal bouquet, but a carefully selected arrangement of late-season blooms that Clara had particularly admired in Eleanor's garden. Alongside these, he carried a small, wrapped package and a card that had taken him hours to compose. The taxi ride to the address Maya had provided took Thomas through residential neighborhoods of Chicago, areas of stately older homes interspersed with modern renovations. David and Clara's former marital home, the place where Sophia had grown up, proved to be a handsome brick Georgian on a tree-lined street, its dignified facade revealing nothing of the emotional complexities contained within. Thomas stood on the sidewalk for several long moments after the taxi departed, gathering his courage. This impulsive journey suddenly seemed presumptuous, perhaps even inappropriate, inserting himself into Clara's carefully constructed space of memory and reflection. Yet the alternative, returning to Vermont without seeing her, allowing their connection to fade into polite distance, seemed worse. With determined steps, Thomas approached the front door and rang the bell. The sound echoed within, followed by footsteps approaching. The door opened to reveal not Clara, but a man Thomas instantly recognized as her ex-husband. Taller than Thomas had imagined, thinner from his recent illness, but with a striking resemblance to the daughter whose photograph Thomas had seen in Clara's cottage. David's expression shifted from neutral expectation to confusion. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Clara," Thomas said, suddenly acutely aware of how strange this unannounced visit must seem. "I'm Thomas Bennett from Vermont." Recognition dawned in David's eyes. "Ah," he said, his tone revealing nothing about what Clara might have shared regarding their relationship. "The professor with the garden." "Yes," Thomas confirmed, oddly relieved to be identified, however reductively. "Clara's not here at the moment," David continued, his manner neither welcoming nor hostile. "She's at the botanical garden, some annual fall event she and Sophia used to attend together." Thomas's heart sank at the missed connection, but David surprised him by adding, "She mentioned she'd be at the lily pond area most of the morning. If you hurry, you might catch her there." "Thank you," Thomas said, genuinely grateful for this unexpected assistance. "Is it far?" "About 20 minutes by taxi," David replied, then hesitated before adding, "She doesn't know you're in Chicago, does she?" "No," Thomas admitted. "It's her birthday. I wanted to surprise her." David's expression softened slightly. "She never was one for birthdays. Always tried to let them pass unnoticed. It's good someone remembers." He paused, then added with careful neutrality, "She's been conflicted these past weeks. Perhaps seeing you will help clarify things for her." The tacit approval from Clara's ex-husband, the man who had once shared her life, who had been father to her beloved Sophia, struck Thomas as unexpectedly significant. "I hope so," he said simply. The Chicago Botanic Garden sprawled across nearly 400 acres of carefully cultivated landscapes, its autumn colors at peak brilliance under the clear October sky. Thomas paid the entrance fee and consulted a map locating the lily pond area with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. He found her sitting alone on a bench overlooking a pond where the season's last water lilies floated among golden reflections of surrounding trees. Clara wore a deep blue coat against the autumn chill, her dark hair touched with more silver than Thomas remembered, her profile contemplative as she gazed across the water. For a moment, Thomas simply watched her, struck by how perfectly she fit into this carefully designed landscape. A woman whose life had been dedicated to creating and preserving beauty amid life's inevitable changes. Then, clutching his modest gifts, he approached. "Happy birthday, Clara," he said softly when he was just a few steps away. She turned with a start, her expression cycling rapidly through shock, confusion, and something that might have been joy before settling into careful neutrality. "Thomas," she said, her voice betraying more emotion than her face. "What are you doing here?" "Bringing you birthday flowers," he replied, holding out the arrangement. "From Eleanor's garden, our garden." Clara accepted the flowers automatically, her fingers brushing against his in the transfer. "How did you know it was my birthday?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "Maya," Thomas admitted, sitting beside her when she made no move to prevent it, "she thought you might appreciate a familiar face today." Clara's gaze returned to the pond, her profile revealing little of her thoughts. "You came all this way, just for my birthday?" "No," Thomas said, deciding that complete honesty was the only appropriate approach. "I came because after 2 months of careful texts and polite distance, I needed to see you, to understand if what we began in Vermont has any future, or if it was simply a temporary connection between two grieving people that's now reached its natural conclusion." The directness of his statement seemed to surprise Clara. She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes studying him with the same careful attention she might give to an unfamiliar plant species. "And if it has reached its conclusion, was the trip worth it then?" "Yes," Thomas said without hesitation. "Even confirmation of an ending would be preferable to this ongoing uncertainty." Clara's expression softened slightly. "I've been unfair to you," she acknowledged, "asking for space and time without giving you any clarity about what that might mean or when it might end." "You've been processing difficult emotions in a place full of memories," Thomas countered gently. "There's nothing unfair about needing time for that." "But 2 months, Thomas," Clara sighed, setting the flowers carefully beside her on the bench. 2 months, and I'm no closer to knowing what I want or where I belong than when I arrived." "Perhaps that itself is an answer," Thomas suggested. "If Chicago hasn't reclaimed you as home after all this time, maybe it's because it isn't home anymore." Clara considered this, her gaze returning to the reflective surface of the pond. "This was Sophia's favorite place," she said finally. "She used to sketch the water lilies for her biology projects, said they were perfect examples of adaptation, rooted in mud but blooming in sunlight." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "We came here every year on my birthday." Her choice, not mine. She knew I hated making a fuss about getting older. Thomas recognized the significance of Clara sharing this intimate detail, one of the countless connections to Sophia that Chicago represented for her. "And now you come alone," he said softly. "Yes," Clara agreed, then corrected herself. "Though, not alone today, it seems." "I can leave," Thomas offered immediately. "If you'd prefer to be here with your memories of her." Clara shook her head. "No, it's fitting somehow that you're here." She turned to face him again. "I've thought about you constantly, Thomas. About Vermont, the garden, the life I was beginning to build there. Wondering if it was real or just an escape from all this." She gestured vaguely around them, encompassing not just the botanical garden, but perhaps all of Chicago and the history it contained. "What conclusion did you reach?" Thomas asked, his heart quickening despite his efforts at emotional restraint. "That's just it," Clara said, frustration evident in her tone. "I haven't reached one. Every time I think I'm ready to return to Vermont, something here pulls me back. A photograph of Sophia I haven't properly sorted, a place we used to visit together, some task related to David's recovery or the house that only I can manage." Thomas nodded, understanding the phenomenon perfectly. "After Eleanor died, I found endless reasons to remain isolated. Papers to grade, books to organize, household maintenance that couldn't possibly wait. All valid reasons that obscured the real one." "Which was?" Clara asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Fear," Thomas said simply. "Fear that stepping back into life meant leaving her behind, that every new experience without her would somehow diminish her importance or betray her memory." Clara's eyes filled suddenly with tears. Yes, she whispered. That's exactly it. Acting on instinct rather than calculation, Thomas reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. But it isn't true, Clara. Eleanor isn't diminished by my continuing to live, any more than Sophia is diminished by your finding purpose and even joy beyond her absence. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, which she brushed away quickly, with her free hand. Intellectually, I know that, but emotionally it feels like betrayal, Thomas finished for her. I know, I felt it too the first time I laughed after Eleanor died. The first time I enjoyed a meal or music or a sunset, as if pleasure itself was disloyal. Clara nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. And then there's the fear, she added softly. The fear of caring deeply again, knowing how devastated I'd be if I lost. She didn't complete the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between them. If I lost you too. I can't promise immortality, Clara, Thomas said, gently. Neither of us can. What we've both learned, painfully, is that love always carries the risk of loss. The only way to avoid that risk entirely is to never love at all. And is that a viable option? Clara asked, the question seemingly directed more at herself than at Thomas. You tell me, Thomas replied. Is that why you've stayed in Chicago? Not just to honor Sophia's memory, but to retreat from the possibility of caring too deeply about someone new? Clara's silence was answer enough. After a long moment, she said, I came to this spot every morning for the first week after I arrived in Chicago, just sat here remembering Sophia, feeling closer to her somehow. But each day, the feeling was a little less intense. The memories, a little less vivid. She looked at Thomas, her expression vulnerable. It frightened me, as if she was fading, becoming less real. She's not fading, Thomas assured her. She's becoming integrated into the person you are now, rather than remaining a separate, overwhelming presence. There's a difference. Clara considered this distinction carefully. Like Eleanor, she observed, she's part of you, not separate from you. That's why you could open the curtains that morning and begin to live again, because you weren't leaving her behind, just carrying her differently. Exactly, Thomas confirmed, deeply moved by Clara's perception. And in a strange way, finding you in her garden that morning felt like a gift from her, as if she had arranged for someone to tend what mattered to her until I was ready to see it again. Clara smiled through her tears. I never thought of it that way. Thomas reached for the small wrapped package he had set beside him on the bench. I brought you something else, he said, suddenly nervous about the gift he had chosen. For your birthday. Clara accepted the package with evident surprise. You didn't need to. I wanted to, Thomas interrupted gently. Please. She unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a small handcrafted wooden box. Opening it, she found a delicate silver necklace with 2 charms, a miniature garden trowel and a small silver book. The trowel represents your care for growing things, Thomas explained as Clara lifted the necklace with gentle fingers. The book is for Sophia's research, Eleanor's garden journals, the stories we share. Both are parts of who you are, your past and your potential future. Clara stared at the necklace for a long moment, then looked up at Thomas with an expression of such unguarded emotion that his breath caught. It's perfect, she whispered. There's a card too, Thomas said, handing her the envelope he had so carefully prepared. Clara opened it to find not a traditional birthday card, but a sheet of Thomas's personal stationery, covered with his precise handwriting. Clara, on your birthday, I find myself thinking not about the years behind you, but about the possibilities ahead. Whatever you decide about Chicago and Vermont, about the past and the future, about us, I want you to know this. You brought life back to Eleanor's garden when I couldn't bear to look at it. In doing so, you helped me find a way back to life as well. For that alone, I would be eternally grateful. But you've become much more than a gardener or even a friend to me. You've become a possibility I never expected to find again. Someone who understands both loss and renewal, who sees me clearly without judgment, who challenges me to grow beyond the comfortable boundaries of grief. I don't know what you'll choose, And I won't pressure you in either direction, but I want you to know that if you decide to return to Vermont, I will be waiting. And if you choose to remain in Chicago, I will understand and still be grateful for the time we shared and the growth you inspired. With deep affection and profound respect, Thomas Clara read the card twice, her fingers tracing the words as if to absorb them through touch as well as sight. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears again, but something had shifted in her expression, a clarity that hadn't been there before, a decision being formed. "I've been hiding," she said simply, using David's health and Sophia's memory as shields against having to make a real choice about the future. She shook her head slightly. "It's not fair, to David, to Sophia's memory, or to you. Or to yourself," Thomas added gently. "Or to myself," Clara agreed. She took a deep breath, as if preparing to voice a truth she had been avoiding for weeks. "I don't belong in Chicago anymore, Thomas. I came back thinking it might reclaim me somehow, that being surrounded by Sophia's things and our shared history would provide clarity. Instead, it's only highlighted how much I've changed since she died, how the life I'm building in Vermont feels more authentic to who I am now than returning to who I was then." The admission seemed to surprise Clara even as she voiced it, a revelation crystallizing in the moment of its articulation. Thomas remained silent, recognizing the importance of allowing her to reach this understanding in her own way. "David doesn't need me here anymore," Clara continued, gathering momentum. "He's recovering well, has a support system in place. The house is mostly sorted, the important keepsakes preserved, the practical decisions about selling it nearly resolved." She looked around at the botanical garden, her expression softening. "And Sophia is with me wherever I go. I don't need to be in Chicago to honor her memory or feel her presence." "No," Thomas agreed softly. "You don't." Clara turned back to him, her eyes now clear and direct. "I want to come home, Thomas, to Vermont, to my cottage and my business, and to see where this journey with you might lead." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "If that offer is still open." "It is," Thomas assured her, his heart lightening with each word. "It absolutely is." Clara slipped the necklace over her head, the silver charms catching the autumn sunlight. "Then I believe it's time for me to properly celebrate my birthday," she said, reaching for his hand, "with someone who remembered it when I was trying to forget." As they walked together through the botanical garden, Clara began sharing plans for her return, practical matters about her cottage, ideas for fall plantings in the garden, questions about Thomas's teaching schedule. With each step, Chicago seemed to recede slightly, Vermont drawing nearer in their shared vision. When they reached the garden's main entrance, Clara paused, looking back at the landscape they were leaving. "I'll come back sometimes," she said, more to herself than to Thomas, "to visit Sophia's special places, to remember, but not to hide." "Not to hide," Thomas echoed, understanding completely the distinction she was making. That evening, they dined together at a small restaurant near Thomas's hotel, sharing stories and plans with an ease that had been absent during his previous Chicago visit. Clara spoke openly about the difficult weeks of sorting through Sophia's belongings, the painful but necessary conversations with David about selling their former home, the gradual recognition that staying in Chicago had become an avoidance strategy rather than a healing process. "When will you return to Vermont?" Thomas asked as they lingered over dessert. 2 weeks, Clara replied with unexpected specificity. "David's sister is arriving next weekend to help with the final house preparations. After that, my work here is truly done." She smiled slightly. "Just in time for the first serious frost in Vermont, I'd imagine. Just in time to plant spring bulbs before the ground freezes," Thomas countered, pleased at how naturally they had returned to their gardening shorthand. Later, as they stood outside Clara's temporary apartment building, the October night cool. Around them, Thomas sensed a shift in their relationship, a clarity of intention that had been obscured by caution and uncertainty before. "Thank you for coming to Chicago," Clara said, her expression open and direct in the glow of the street lamp, "for not giving up on me, even when I was hiding from myself." "I almost didn't come," Thomas admitted. Wasn't sure if I was respecting your need for space or simply avoiding a difficult conversation. I'm glad you came, Clara said simply. She stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers, an echo of their parting 2 months earlier, but with a different quality now, a certainty that had been absent before. This time when Clara kissed him, Thomas responded without hesitation, drawing her closer in an embrace that felt simultaneously like a beginning and a homecoming. The kiss deepened, communicating months of unspoken feelings, shared understanding, and newfound clarity about what they might become to each other. When they finally parted, Clara's eyes reflected the same wonder Thomas felt, that after so much loss, such painful absences, life could still offer this unexpected gift of connection. 2 weeks, she repeated softly, a promise rather than a time frame. I'll be waiting, Thomas assured her. The garden and I both. Thomas returned to Vermont the following day, his spirit lighter than it had been in months. The clarity achieved during his Chicago visit, Clara's decision to return, their mutual acknowledgement of deeper feelings, the kiss that had sealed both, provided a sense of purpose and anticipation that transformed his daily routine. The garden. Work that had previously been tinged with uncertainty now felt like preparation for Clara's return. Each task a small act of faith in their shared future. The promised 2 weeks stretched unexpectedly to 3, as David's sister's arrival was delayed by a family emergency, requiring Clara to remain in Chicago longer than planned. Though disappointing, the extension seemed a minor setback, given the certainty they now shared about her eventual return. Their daily communications reflected this new understanding. Phone calls rather than texts, conversations that ranged beyond practical matters to include personal reflections, tentative plans for her homecoming, and careful explorations of their evolving feelings for each other. I've started packing up my apartment, Clara reported during an evening call in late October. It's strange how little I actually unpacked in the 3 months I've been here, as if some part of me always knew this was temporary. The cottage is ready whenever you are, Thomas assured her. I've been keeping it aired out, watering your plants. Even rescued that fern in the bathroom that was looking rather pitiful. Clara laughed, the sound warming Thomas even across the distance between them. My hero, she teased, saving helpless ferns from certain death. These light exchanges, interspersed with more serious discussions about their respective grief journeys and hopes for the future, created a bridge across the physical separation. Thomas found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he had previously kept guarded, encouraged by Clara's reciprocal openness. I worried that caring for you somehow diminished what I had with Eleanor, he admitted during one late-night conversation. But I've come to understand that the heart doesn't have limited capacity. Loving someone new doesn't reduce what came before, it builds upon it. Like gardens, Clara observed, each season's growth doesn't erase what was planted before. It adds layers, complexity. The design evolves without destroying the original vision. Their gardening metaphors had become a private language, a way of articulating emotional truths through the shared vocabulary of cultivation and growth. Thomas found himself collecting observations about the autumn garden specifically to share with Clara, knowing she would appreciate both the horticultural details and their symbolic resonance. The first week of November brought the promised frost to Vermont, transforming the landscape into crystalline beauty that Thomas described to Clara in detail during their evening call. Eleanor always said the first frost was the garden's way of preparing for renewal, he told her. A necessary ending that makes space for new beginnings. I'll be there for those new beginnings, Clara promised. Just a few more days to finish up here. Her voice took on a more serious tone. Thomas, there's something I need to tell you about coming back. The shift in her voice caused a momentary tightening in Thomas's chest. What is it? I've been thinking about my cottage, Clara began carefully. It's perfect for one person, but if we're going to explore this relationship more seriously... Yes? Thomas prompted when she hesitated. I think I need my own space, at least initially, Clara continued, to make sure we're building something solid, not just responding to proximity and convenience. Relief washed through Thomas at the relatively minor concern. "Of course," he assured her. "I never assumed you'd be moving in with me, Clara. We have time to figure out how this relationship develops." "Thank you for understanding," Clara said, the smile evident in her voice. "Sometimes I overthink things." "One of your more endearing qualities," Thomas teased gently. The call ended with their usual exchange of anticipation for her imminent return, now scheduled definitively for the following Tuesday, just 5 days away. Thomas hung up feeling content, already mentally planning the welcome dinner he would prepare, the books he wanted to share with her, the garden projects they could begin before winter fully settled in. The next morning, however, brought an unexpected call from Maya rather than Clara. "Thomas," she began without preamble, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "There's been an accident." The world seemed to slow around Thomas, his mind immediately leaping to worst case scenarios. "Clara?" he managed to ask, his voice barely audible. "She's alive," Maya assured him quickly. "But it's serious. She was helping David move some furniture at the house when a bookcase collapsed. She pushed him out of the way, but it fell on her instead." Thomas gripped the phone tighter, forcing himself to breathe. "How bad?" "Multiple fractures in her left leg and hip. Surgery last night went well, but recovery will be lengthy. 3 months minimum before weight-bearing, possibly longer." Maya paused, then added gently, "She won't be returning to Vermont next week, Thomas, or any time soon." The news hit Thomas with physical force, as if the collapsing bookcase had somehow reached across the distance to strike him as well. "I'm coming to Chicago," he said immediately. "Today? Which hospital?" "Northwestern Memorial," Maya provided. "But Thomas, before you book anything, there's something else you should know. Clara's conflicted about seeing you." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, confusion compounding his distress. Maya sighed audibly. "This injury changes everything for her immediate future. She'll need extensive rehabilitation, multiple surgeries possibly. She can't live alone during recovery, especially in a small town where she has limited support system." She hesitated, then continued reluctantly. "David has offered to let her stay at his house during recovery. It's already being modified for accessibility because of his heart condition. His sister will be there to help with daily care." "And Clara's considering this?" Thomas asked, the implications clear, even through his shock. "She is," Maya confirmed. "It's the practical solution, Thomas, but I think she's also using it as an excuse to withdraw again. The old pattern, retreat when vulnerability becomes too threatening." Thomas sat heavily in the nearest chair, struggling to process this sudden reversal of their carefully constructed plans. "What did she say about me visiting?" "That's just it," Maya replied, frustration evident in her tone. "She won't say anything directly, just keeps insisting she doesn't want to be a burden on anyone, that her recovery will be difficult and unpleasant, that you have your teaching and the garden to maintain." She paused. Classic Clara deflection techniques. Thomas recognized the pattern Maya described, Clara's tendency to withdraw when feeling most vulnerable, to protect others, from her pain even at the cost of her own isolation. He had seen glimpses of this during their early interactions in the garden, her careful maintenance of emotional boundaries, even as their relationship deepened. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, valuing Maya's insight into her sister's complex psychology. "Honestly, I think you should come anyway," Maya said firmly. "Clara's making decisions based on fear right now. Fear of dependency, fear of being seen at her most vulnerable, fear of what this setback means for your relationship." She sighed. "She probably won't thank me for telling you this, but when they were prepping her for surgery, she was worried about what this meant for you and her. It's on her mind, Thomas, even if she's pushing you away right now." The knowledge that Clara was thinking of their relationship, even in her moment of crisis, strengthened Thomas's resolve. "I'll be on the next available flight," he told Maya. "Text me the hospital details." After ending the call, Thomas moved, with the same decisive energy that had propelled him to Chicago for Clara's birthday. Within hours, he had arranged for a colleague to cover his classes, asked his neighbor to continue maintaining both his garden and Clara's cottage, and booked a flight to Chicago departing that evening. Unlike his previous trips, this journey felt not like a choice but a necessity, as if the connection between them, once fully acknowledged, created obligations that transcended conventional boundaries. The hospital room where Clara had been moved post-surgery was dimly lit when Thomas arrived the following morning, the blinds drawn against the November sunlight. She lay with her eyes closed, her left leg elevated and immobilized in a complex arrangement of braces and bandages, an IV line snaking from her right arm to a stand beside the bed. Even in sleep, her face reflected pain, fine lines etched around, her eyes and mouth that hadn't been present 2 weeks earlier. Thomas stood silently in the doorway, suddenly uncertain about his impulsive journey. Was Maya right about Clara's need for his presence, or was he imposing himself when she most needed space? Before he could decide whether to enter or retreat, Clara's eyes opened, immediately finding him as if she had sensed his presence, even through medication-induced sleep. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice raspy from intubation during surgery. "How you shouldn't have come." The words stung, but Thomas detected something beneath them, not rejection, but fear, perhaps even shame. He moved to her bedside, careful not to disturb the medical equipment surrounding her. "Where else would I be?" he asked simply. Clara's eyes filled with tears that she blinked away quickly. "This isn't what we planned," she said, gesturing weakly at her immobilized body. "This changes everything." "It changes logistics," Thomas corrected gently, "not feelings." Clara turned her face away, staring at the blank wall rather than meeting his gaze. 3 months minimum before I can put weight on this leg. Possibly more surgeries, physical therapy for who knows how long. Her voice hardened slightly. "I can't live alone during recovery, can't manage stairs, can't garden, can't do any of the things that defined my life in Vermont." "Temporarily," Thomas emphasized. "This is a setback, Clara, not a permanent condition." "Easy for you to say," Clara responded, an edge entering her tone. "You're not the one facing months of dependency and pain." Thomas recognized the deflection technique Maya had described, Clara's attempt to push him away, to protect both of them from the messy reality of her recovery. Rather than being deterred, he pulled a chair closer to her bedside and sat down, a clear signal that he wasn't easily dismissed. "No, I'm not," he acknowledged, "and I won't pretend to understand exactly what you're facing. But I do understand something about having life's plans suddenly derailed." He reached for her hand, encouraged when she didn't pull away. "When Eleanor died, everything I thought I knew about my future disappeared overnight. This isn't the same as losing a spouse, but it is a reminder that life rarely follows our careful plans." Clara finally turned back to face him, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude for his presence and resistance to the comfort he offered. "David's offered to let me stay at his house during recovery," she said, watching Thomas's face carefully as she delivered this information. "Maya mentioned that," Thomas replied evenly. "It makes practical sense given that the house is already being modified for accessibility." "You're not upset?" Clara asked, seeming almost disappointed by his measured response. Thomas chose his words carefully, aware of the fragility of Clara's emotional state. "I'm disappointed that your return to Vermont has been delayed. I'm concerned about your recovery and how challenging it will be. But upset that you're considering the most practical housing arrangement available to you." "No. It would mean staying in Chicago indefinitely," Clara pressed, as if testing his commitment. "Months, possibly a year, depending on how the recovery progresses." "I'm aware of that," Thomas said, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the internal adjustment such a timeline required. "Distance makes things more complicated, but not impossible." Clara studied him intently, as if searching for signs of wavering or insincerity. Finding none, she sighed deeply, some of the defensive tension leaving her body. "I don't want you to put your life on hold for me, Thomas. You have teaching, the garden, your own healing journey to continue. This," she gestured at her immobilized. "Alison, this isn't what you signed up for." "Neither was finding you in Eleanor's garden that morning," Thomas countered with gentle humor. "Life rarely asks our permission before changing course." He squeezed her hand lightly. "Clara, I'm not naive about the challenges ahead. Long-distance relationships are difficult in the best circumstances, and these are far from ideal. But what we've found with each other, the connection, the understanding, the possibility of something lasting, that's worth navigating some obstacles, isn't it? Clara's expression softened slightly, the defensive wall she had erected beginning to show cracks. "I'm afraid," she admitted in a near whisper. "Afraid of being dependent. Afraid of you seeing me like this, weak, broken. Afraid that what we felt for each other was tied to the garden, to Vermont, to the specific circumstances that brought us together." The vulnerability of her admission touched Thomas deeply. "I understand fear," he said quietly. "I lived behind closed curtains for a year because of it. But you were the one who showed me that hiding from life doesn't actually protect us from pain. It just prevents us from experiencing joy alongside it." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, which she made no attempt to brush away. "Using my own wisdom against me," she said with a ghost of her usual dry humor. "Unfair advantage, Professor Bennett." Thomas smiled, relieved to see this glimpse of her resilient spirit. "I learned from the best," he replied. "A very wise gardener once told me that most mistakes can be fixed, and even when they can't, there's always next season." Clara's laugh emerged as a pained sound, cut short by the discomfort it caused her injured body. "Touché," she conceded. She was quiet for a moment, then asked in a more serious tone, "What would this even look like, Thomas? Me here, you in Vermont, both of us trying to maintain whatever this is becoming between us?" "It would look like phone calls and video chats," Thomas began thoughtfully. "Like weekend visits when possible, like sharing our daily experiences even when we can't be physically present for them." He squeezed her hand gently. "It would look like patience and trust, and the understanding that what we're building is worth the temporary separation." "And if it's not temporary?" Clara challenged, voicing the fear that clearly haunted her. "If complications develop, if recovery takes longer than expected, if I can never garden the way I used to, then we adapt," Thomas said simply. "Just as we've both adapted to losses far greater than physical limitations." He met her gaze directly. "Clara, do you think what I value most about you is your ability to kneel in garden beds or climb stairs?" The question hung between them, Clara's expression revealing both vulnerability and hope. "What do you value most?" she asked softly. "Your compassion," Thomas answered without hesitation. "Your understanding of both growth and loss. Your ability to see beauty where others might see only decay. Your courage in facing painful truths." He smiled slightly. "Your gardening skills are impressive, certainly, but they're not what drew me to you or what makes me want to see where this relationship might lead." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, but she made no attempt to hide them this time. "I don't want to burden you with this," she whispered, gesturing at her injured body. "You're not a burden, Clara," Thomas said firmly. "You're a person I care deeply about who's experiencing a temporary health crisis. There's a difference." The distinction seemed to reach something essential in Clara, breaking through the protective barriers she had been attempting to erect. She tightened her grip on Thomas's hand, as if anchoring herself to the connection between them. "I'm not very good at being vulnerable," she admitted, "or at accepting help." "I've noticed," Thomas replied with gentle teasing. "Fortunately, these are skills that can be developed with practice." Clara smiled, a genuine expression despite her evident pain and fatigue. "You're really not going to let me push you away, are you?" "Not without a fight," Thomas confirmed, "though I'll respect whatever boundaries you genuinely need during recovery. I'm not here to complicate your healing process, Clara, just to make sure you know you're not facing it alone." The relief in Clara's expression was palpable, as if a burden had been lifted that she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, the words a stark contrast to her initial greeting. "I thought I was protecting both of us by trying to handle this alone, but isolation rarely protects us from anything worth avoiding," Thomas finished for her. "Another lesson we've both had to learn the hard way." Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse arriving to check Clara's vital signs and administer pain medication. Thomas stepped back, observing with concern how Clara's face tightened with pain at even the slight adjustments necessary for the medical assessment. When the nurse left, promising that the medication would take effect soon, Clara looked noticeably more exhausted, the brief emotional breakthrough clearly having taxed her limited energy reserves. "You should rest," Thomas said, rising from his chair. "I'll come back this evening if that's all right." Clara nodded, her eyelids already growing heavy from the medication. "Thomas," she murmured as he turned to leave, "I meant what I said before the accident. About us. About wanting to see where this leads." "I know," Thomas assured her, touched by her effort to communicate this despite her pain and fatigue. "So did I, that hasn't changed." As Clara drifted into medicated sleep, Thomas stepped into the hospital corridor, suddenly overwhelming by the emotional intensity of their exchange. The future he and Clara had been carefully constructing had been dramatically altered in an instant. Their plans for her imminent return to Vermont replaced by the reality of a lengthy recovery in Chicago, their gradually evolving relationship now challenged by distance and medical complications. Yet beneath his natural concern about these practical obstacles, Thomas recognized a deeper truth. The accident had catalyzed precisely the kind of vulnerable communication they had been cautiously approaching for months. Clara's defenses, temporarily weakened by pain and medication, had allowed a level of emotional honesty that might have taken much longer to achieve under normal circumstances. As Thomas navigated the hospital corridors toward the exit, his phone chimed with a text message from Maya. "How did it go? Is she still trying to push you away?" Thomas composed a thoughtful reply. "We had a good talk. Defenses down, at least temporarily. I'm staying in Chicago for a few days to help with immediate transition planning. Then we'll figure out a longer-term strategy." Maya's response came quickly. "Thank you for not giving up on her. She needs you more than she can admit, even to herself." The simple acknowledgement strengthened Thomas's resolve as he stepped out into the crisp Chicago afternoon. The path ahead would not be the one he and Clara had envisioned just days earlier, but perhaps this unexpected detour would ultimately lead them to a deeper, more resilient connection than their original route might have allowed. November 9th, Clara's accident has changed everything and nothing. The logistics of our relationship have been completely upended, but the essential connection between us remains, perhaps even strengthened by this sudden reminder of life's unpredictability. Eleanor always said, "True character emerges in crisis." I believe she would approve of how Clara and I are facing this one, with honesty, courage, and the willingness to adapt without surrendering what matters most. The harsh Chicago winter settled over the city like a heavy blanket, transforming familiar landscapes into stark contrasts of white snow and dark silhouettes. Thomas, returning for his fourth weekend visit since Clara's accident, found himself developing a grudging appreciation for the city's architectural beauty, enhanced by winter light, though he still preferred Vermont's more natural winter palette. 2 months had passed since the bookcase collapse. 2 months of carefully navigated long-distance relationship building amid the complications of Clara's medical recovery. The initial surgery had been followed by a second 3 weeks later to further stabilize her hip joint, extending her non-weight-bearing status into the new year. Christmas had found Thomas in Chicago rather than Vermont, sharing an awkward but ultimately meaningful holiday dinner with Clara, David, and David's sister Martha in the modified first floor of the house where Clara now resided. "You're earlier than expected," Clara observed as Thomas entered her temporary bedroom, which had been converted from David's home office to accommodate her needs. She sat in a specialized recliner by the window, her immobilized leg elevated, a book open on her lap. Despite the physical constraints, she had regained much of her natural dignity and poise, adapting to her circumstances with characteristic determination. "Flight was on time for once," Thomas replied, leaning down to kiss her in greeting. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Clara said, her smile reaching her eyes, a good sign Thomas had learned to watch for. "Physical therapist. Says I'm making excellent progress with upper body strength. Critical for crutches eventually." Thomas settled into the chair opposite hers, taking in the subtle improvements in her appearance since his last visit, less pain evident in her expression, a healthier color in her cheeks, her hair styled more carefully rather than simply pulled back for convenience. "You look stronger," he observed. "I feel stronger," Clara confirmed. She gestured at her elevated leg. "Still frustratingly immobile, but the pain is more manageable now. And I've started working remotely with a client in Minneapolis, a landscape design project for their spring renovation." "That's wonderful," Thomas said, genuinely pleased at this sign of Clara reconnecting with her professional identity. "Tell me about it." As Clara described the project with evident enthusiasm, Thomas listened with both attention and relief. The early weeks after her accident had been extremely difficult. Pain management problems, complications from the second surgery, and Clara's deep frustration with her dependency, creating an emotional backdrop that challenged their developing relationship. There had been dark moments when Thomas questioned whether they could sustain their connection through such adversity, particularly when Clara retreated into silence during difficult days or when the physical distance between Vermont and Chicago seemed insurmountable. Yet somehow, through daily phone calls, weekend visits when possible, and a shared commitment to honesty even when it was painful, they had not merely survived the crisis, but found their relationship deepening in unexpected ways. "How was your week?" Clara asked when she finished describing her design project. "How are the students responding to the new Victorian literature seminar?" Thomas smiled, warmed by her genuine interest in his teaching, a constant in their communications despite the medical dramas that might have justified more self-absorption on Clara's part. They're surprisingly engaged with George Eliot. Less so with Hardy, though one young woman gave a particularly insightful presentation on botanical symbolism in Tess of the D'Urbervilles that made me think of you. "High praise indeed," Clara teased, reaching for his hand. "And the garden? Has the snow cover been adequate protection for the new perennials?" 8 inches last week, still holding steady, Thomas reported. "Everything should be well insulated until spring." He hesitated, then added carefully, "I've been thinking about spring plantings, actually, wondering what you might want to add when you return." Clara's expression shifted subtly at the mention of her return, a topic that remained somewhat fraught between them. Her recovery timeline had been extended multiple times, medical caution and practical considerations pushing her potential return to Vermont further into the future than either had initially expected. "Thomas," she began, with the gentle tone he had come to recognize as preceding difficult conversations. "We should talk about that, about spring, about Vermont." Thomas felt a flutter of anxiety, but kept his expression open and attentive. "I'm listening." Clara adjusted her position slightly, wincing as the movement disturbed her healing hip. "The orthopedist says I won't be cleared for fully independent living until April at the earliest. Even then, I'll need regular physical therapy, periodic follow-up surgeries possibly." She met his gaze directly. "I've been thinking that perhaps it makes sense for me to sell the cottage in Vermont." Though they had discussed this possibility abstractly, hearing Clara state it as a consideration she was actively contemplating hit Thomas with unexpected force. "I see," he said carefully, not wanting his immediate emotional reaction to override. "Rational discussion. And live where?" "I'm still figuring that out," Clara admitted. "Chicago has excellent medical facilities, which is an advantage. But it's not where I want to be long-term, for many of the reasons we discussed before the accident." She squeezed his hand gently. "I'm not running away from what we're building, Thomas, just trying to be practical about the circumstances." Thomas nodded, processing the complex implications. "Have you considered a third option? Neither your small cottage nor Chicago, but something that might accommodate your recovery needs while still allowing you to be in Vermont." Clara tilted her head slightly, curiosity evident in her expression. "What did you have in mind?" "There's a garden. Apartment in my house," Thomas said, the idea crystallizing even as he voiced it. "Originally the servants' quarters when the house was built, though Eleanor and I always used it as a guest suite. Ground floor, separate entrance, but connected to the main house. It would give you independence, but proximity to help if needed." Clara's expression registered surprise, then thoughtful consideration. That's actually a reasonable solution, she acknowledged. But Thomas, moving in with you, even with separate spaces, that's a significant step for any relationship, let alone one as complicated as ours. It would be temporary, Thomas clarified. A transition arrangement while you continue recovery. After that, we could reassess based on where we are in our relationship and what makes sense for both of us. Clara studied him intently, clearly weighing multiple factors. You've given this some thought, she observed. More than some, Thomas admitted with a small smile. I've been considering options for weeks, but wanted to wait until you were ready for the conversation. This acknowledgement seemed to touch Clara deeply. His recognition of her need to maintain some control over life-altering decisions despite her physically dependent state. Thank you for that, she said softly, for not trying to solve everything immediately. I've learned patience, Thomas replied, from gardening and from loving women who value their independence. The comment hung between them, the word loving emerging naturally, but representing the first time either had approached such direct acknowledgement of their deepening feelings. Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't retreat from the implicit confession. I've been doing a lot of thinking during these weeks of enforced stillness, she said after a moment, about dependency, vulnerability, what it means to truly share a life with someone after being alone for so long. And what conclusions have you reached? Thomas asked, his heart quickening at the serious turn in their conversation. Clara smiled, a mixture of certainty and lingering vulnerability in her expression. That independence isn't the same as isolation, that accepting help doesn't diminish my strength, but acknowledges my humanity. She met his gaze directly. That, what's growing between us is worth nurturing, even if the path is more complicated than we expected. I've reached similar conclusions, Thomas said, profoundly moved by her openness. Your garden, apartment solution is worth considering seriously, Clara continued, her practical nature reasserting itself. But I'd want clear parameters, financial independence, a defined timeline for reassessment, honest communication about how the arrangement is working for both of us. Of course, Thomas agreed readily. I wouldn't want it any other way. Clara nodded, satisfied with his response. Then let's explore it further. Perhaps you could take some photos. We could discuss potential modifications for accessibility. She smiled slightly. I'd need to be convinced the light is adequate for my houseplants. Priorities, Thomas teased, relieved at her willingness to consider the possibility. The apartment faces south and west. Eleanor always said it had the best natural light in the house. Eleanor would know, Clara said softly, her expression turning reflective. Do you think she would mind? Me living in your house, even temporarily? The question surprised Thomas, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Clara had always shown remarkable sensitivity to Eleanor's continuing presence in his life, never attempting to minimize or replace those memories. No, he said with certainty. She would approve, I think. She was always practical about helping others, and she valued independence highly herself. Clara nodded, seemingly reassured. Then let's consider it a potential plan, pending further investigation. April is still several months away. Their conversation shifted to other topics. Thomas's department colleagues, Clara's physical therapy progress, books they had both been reading. Later that evening, as they shared a simple dinner in Clara's room, David and Martha having tactfully arranged to dine out, Thomas observed how their relationship had evolved since her accident. The forced separation, rather than weakening their connection, had required them to develop communication skills that might have taken much longer under normal circumstances. Unable to rely on the shared physical experience of gardening together or casual proximity, they had built a relationship founded on intentional conversation, explicit articulation of needs and boundaries, and a mutual commitment to honesty even when difficult. What are you thinking about? Clara asked, noticing his thoughtful expression as she finished her meal. How adversity can be transformative, Thomas replied, not in the cliched, everything happens for a reason way, but in how it forces us to develop resources we might otherwise leave dormant. Clara nodded, understanding immediately. Like how losing Eleanor eventually led you to open your curtains and find me in your garden. Exactly, Thomas agreed. Or how your accident, terrible as it was, has given us space to build a foundation for our relationship based on more than just shared gardening and grief recovery. A strong foundation, Clara added softly, reaching for his hand across the small table. Though I still miss the garden terribly. It misses you too, Thomas assured her, but it's waiting patiently, as am I. The remainder of the weekend passed in comfortable companionship, Thomas reading aloud from books Clara had requested, helping with her prescribed exercises, and simply sitting together through the quiet winter afternoons. On Sunday evening, before departing for his return flight to Vermont, Thomas raised the subject of Valentine's Day, which would fall during his next planned visit. Nothing extravagant, he promised, noting Clara's instinctive wariness of conventional romantic gestures. But perhaps dinner somewhere other than this bedroom? The doctor mentioned you might be cleared for brief outings by then. Clara considered this, then nodded with a small smile. I'd like that. Something to look forward to beyond physical therapy appointments and surgeon consultations. A date, Thomas said, deliberately using the term they had both carefully avoided in describing their relationship. A date, Clara echoed, accepting the label with a glint of humor in her eyes. At the advanced age of 42, I find myself looking forward to a Valentine's date. Life is full of surprises. Indeed it is, Thomas agreed, leaning down to kiss her goodbye. A gesture that had evolved from briefly affectionate to lingering and meaningful over their months of separated connection. I'll call when I land. Safe travels, Clara replied, her expression revealing the depth of feeling she still sometimes struggled to articulate directly. And Thomas, thank you for everything. The simple acknowledgement contained multitudes: gratitude for his patience during her difficult recovery, appreciation for his willingness to adapt their relationship to challenging circumstances, recognition of the emotional support he provided consistently despite the physical distance between them. Always, Thomas said simply, the word a promise rather than mere politeness. Flying back to Vermont through the clear winter night, Thomas reflected on the journey he and Clara had navigated since that April morning when he had first opened his curtains to find her in Eleanor's garden. From strangers connected only by a shared understanding of loss, they had evolved into something neither could have anticipated. Partners in a relationship defined not by convenience or circumstance, but by deliberate choice and mutual growth. The garden apartment would need work before April, accessibility modifications, updated fixtures, perhaps new paint in colors Clara would find welcoming. The prospect of these preparations energized rather than daunted Thomas, providing concrete expression of his commitment to creating space for Clara in his life, both literally and figuratively. January 21st. Clara continues to heal both physically and emotionally. The possibility of her moving into the garden apartment represents more than a practical solution to her recovery needs. It symbolizes our mutual willingness to create new patterns rather than simply restoring what existed before. Eleanor always said that the most beautiful gardens incorporate unexpected elements, adapting to changing conditions rather than rigidly maintaining original designs. Clara and I seem to be learning this lesson in our relationship as well, finding beauty in the necessary adaptations rather than merely surviving them. Valentine's Day in Chicago dawned clear and bitterly cold, the temperature hovering near zero as Thomas made his way from his hotel to the medical facility where Clara was. Scheduled for her 3-month post-surgical evaluation, they had agreed to meet there rather than at David's house, allowing Thomas to participate directly in conversations with Clara's medical team about her progress and ongoing recovery needs. The waiting room was crowded with other patients and families. The institutional atmosphere decidedly unromantic despite the date. Thomas spotted Clara immediately, seated in a wheelchair near the reception desk, her injured leg extended before her, hair neatly styled, and wearing a deep burgundy sweater he hadn't seen before. She looked up as he approached, her face brightening, in that particular way that never failed to warm him, regardless of external temperatures. "You made it through airport security with those intact?" she asked, nodding toward the small bouquet of early spring flowers he carried. Snowdrops, crocuses, and witch hazel, a tiny harbinger of the season to come in Vermont. "Barely," Thomas admitted, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "The TSA agent was highly suspicious until I explained they were Valentine's flowers for my—" He hesitated fractionally, still uncertain about terminology. "For someone special recovering from surgery." Clara's smile widened at his verbal stumble. "You're someone special. I like that designation. More accurate than girlfriend at our age, less formal than partner." "My thinking exactly," Thomas agreed, relieved by her easy acceptance. He presented the bouquet with a small flourish. "These are blooming in our garden now. I thought you might like a preview of what's waiting for you in Vermont." Clara accepted the flowers with genuine delight, burying her nose in the delicate blooms. "They're perfect," she said softly. "Thank you for remembering. I prefer living flowers to cut roses." "I pay attention," Thomas replied simply. Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse calling Clara's name. Thomas wheeled her into the examination room, then waited while she was helped onto the examination table by medical staff. The doctor's arrival brought the formal evaluation: physical manipulation of the healing joint, review of recent X-rays, discussion of pain levels, and mobility progress. Thomas listened attentively, noting both the positive assessments and the continuing cautions. Clara's recovery was proceeding well, with bone healing on schedule and inflammation decreasing steadily. But the road ahead remained long: continued physical therapy, weight-bearing restrictions for at least another month, and ongoing pain management challenges. "When might she be cleared for independent living?" Thomas asked, during a pause in the technical discussion. "We're considering arrangements in Vermont for her continued recovery." The doctor looked to Clara first, clearly accustomed to addressing the patient directly rather than through companions. At her nod of permission, he replied, "Mid-April would be the earliest I'd recommend for a major transition like that. By then, Ms. Martinez should be ambulatory with assistive devices and managing most activities of daily living independently, though with modifications." "And the garden apartment adaptation we discussed?" Clara asked, referencing previous conversations about her potential living arrangements. "From the photos and measurements you've provided, it seems workable with the modifications we outlined," the doctor confirmed. "Ground floor access, wheelchair-accessible bathroom, proximity to support if needed. All significant advantages during this phase of recovery." Clara and Thomas exchanged a quick glance of shared understanding. The medical approval reinforcing the practical plans they had been developing over the past month. Since their January discussion, Thomas had begun modest renovations to the garden apartment, sending Clara regular photo updates and incorporating her suggestions about accessibility features that would support her independence while accommodating her physical limitations. After the appointment concluded with formal approval for increased activity levels and their first official dinner outing, Thomas wheeled Clara back through the waiting room toward the hospital exit. "Good news overall," he observed. "April is looking more definitive now." "Yes," Clara agreed, though Thomas detected a note of hesitation in her tone. "If all continues as projected." "You're still concerned," he noted, as they navigated the hospital corridor. Clara nodded slightly. "Cautiously optimistic, let's say. I've learned not to count too heavily on specific timelines when it comes to recovery." This measured approach, neither pessimistic nor unrealistically positive, characterized Clara's attitude throughout her healing process. Thomas had come to respect this balanced perspective, so different from his own tendency toward either complete withdrawal or excessive optimism. "Fair enough," he acknowledged, "but definitive enough to continue with the apartment preparations?" "Absolutely," Clara confirmed with more certainty. "Even if the timeline shifts somewhat, the destination remains the same: Vermont in spring." The phrase hung between them like a promise as they emerged from the medical building into the bright February afternoon. Despite the freezing temperature, the quality of light had changed subtly from winter's harsh clarity to a softer illumination that hinted at the approaching seasonal shift. Their Valentine's dinner took place at a small restaurant near David's house, selected for both its accessibility and its intimate atmosphere. Clara managed the transition from wheelchair to dining chair with practiced movements, her increasing strength and mobility evident in the fluid motion. Thomas watched with appreciation for both her physical progress and her unwavering determination throughout the recovery process. "This feels wonderfully normal," Clara observed, once they were settled at a corner table adorned with a small candle and a single red rose. "Almost like a proper date." "It is a proper date," Thomas insisted with a smile, "complete with flowers, candlelight, and overpriced menu items." Clara laughed, a sound that had become increasingly frequent as her pain levels decreased and her confidence in recovery grew. "All we're missing is the awkward getting-to-know-you conversation of typical first dates. Though I suppose we did that backward. Crisis first, dating after." "Nothing conventional about us," Thomas agreed, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Which seems appropriate given our respective histories." Clara's expression turned more reflective. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been in your garden that morning. If you had opened your curtains to find only Eleanor's neglected plants instead of me tending them." "I've wondered that too," Thomas admitted. "Though I suspect our paths might have crossed eventually, given the size of our town. Perhaps at a garden center or community event." "Perhaps," Clara conceded. "But would we have recognized each other as kindred spirits without the garden as context? Without that immediate vulnerability of being caught in my trespassing and your grief?" The question was profound in its simplicity, addressing the serendipitous nature of their meeting and the unique circumstances that had allowed them to connect beyond conventional social barriers. Thomas considered it carefully before responding. "I'd like to think so," he said finally, "though perhaps it would have taken longer, been more circumspect. The garden gave us an immediate shared language, a way of communicating about growth and loss that transcended ordinary small talk." Clara nodded, satisfaction in her expression at his thoughtful response. "It was also neutral territory in a way, neither entirely yours nor mine, but a shared space of stewardship." She smiled slightly. "I never expected to find connection through gardening in someone else's yard. It seems almost absurd when stated plainly. Life's most significant relationships often begin in unexpected ways," Thomas observed. "Eleanor and I met when she returned a library book to the wrong campus office and ended up arguing with me about Victorian literature for an hour before realizing her mistake." "You've never told me that story," Clara said. "We outlined," the doctor confirmed. "Ground floor access, wheelchair-accessible bathroom, proximity to support if needed, all significant advantages during this phase of recovery." Clara and Thomas exchanged a quick glance of shared understanding, the medical approval reinforcing the practical plans they had been developing over the past month. Since their January discussion, Thomas had begun modest renovations to the garden apartment, sending Clara regular photo updates and incorporating her suggestions about accessibility features that would support her independence while accommodating her physical limitations. After the appointment concluded with formal approval for increased activity levels and their first official dinner outing, Thomas wheeled Clara back through the waiting room toward the hospital exit. "Good news overall," he observed. "April is looking more definitive now." "Yes," Clara agreed, though Thomas detected a note of hesitation in her tone. "If all continues as projected." "You're still concerned," he noted as they navigated the hospital corridor. Clara nodded slightly. "Cautiously optimistic, let's say. I've learned not to count too heavily on specific timelines when it comes to recovery." This measured approach, neither pessimistic nor unrealistically positive, characterized Clara's attitude throughout her healing process. Thomas had come to respect this balanced perspective, so different from his own tendency toward either complete withdrawal or excessive optimism. "Fair enough," he acknowledged, "but definitive enough to continue with the apartment preparations?" "Absolutely," Clara confirmed with more certainty. "Even if the timeline shifts somewhat, the destination remains the same: Vermont in spring." The phrase hung between them like a promise as they emerged from the medical building into the bright February afternoon. Despite the freezing temperature, the quality of light had changed subtly from winter's harsh clarity to a softer illumination that hinted at the approaching seasonal shift. Their Valentine's dinner took place at a small restaurant near David's house, selected for both its accessibility and its intimate atmosphere. Clara managed the transition from wheelchair to dining chair with practiced movements, her increasing strength and mobility evident in the fluid motion. Thomas watched with appreciation for both her physical progress and her unwavering determination throughout the recovery process. "This feels wonderfully normal," Clara observed once they were settled at a corner table adorned with a small candle and a single red rose. "Almost like a proper date." "It is a proper date," Thomas insisted with a smile, complete with flowers, candlelight, and overpriced menu items. Clara laughed, a sound that had become increasingly frequent as her pain levels decreased and her confidence in recovery grew. "All we're missing is the awkward getting-to-know-you conversation of typical first dates, though I suppose we did that backward. Crisis first, dating after." "Nothing conventional about us," Thomas agreed, reaching across the table to take her hand, "which seems appropriate given our respective histories." Clara's expression turned more reflective. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been in your garden that morning. If you had opened your curtains to find only Eleanor's neglected plants instead of me tending them." "I've wondered that too," Thomas admitted. "Though I suspect our paths might have crossed eventually, given the size of our town. Perhaps at a garden center or community event?" "Perhaps," Clara conceded. "But would we have recognized each other as kindred spirits without the garden as context? Without that immediate vulnerability of being caught in my trespassing and your grief?" The question was profound in its simplicity, addressing the serendipitous nature of their meeting and the unique circumstances that had allowed them to connect beyond conventional social barriers. Thomas considered it carefully before responding. "I'd like to think so," he said finally, "though perhaps it would have taken longer, been more circumspect. The garden gave us an immediate shared language, a way of communicating about growth and loss that transcended ordinary small talk." Clara nodded, satisfaction in her expression at his thoughtful response. "It was also neutral territory in a way, neither entirely yours nor mine, but a shared space of stewardship." She smiled slightly. "I never expected to find connection through gardening in someone else's yard. It seems almost absurd when stated plainly. Life's most significant relationships often begin in unexpected ways," Thomas observed. "Eleanor and I met when she returned a library book to the wrong campus office and ended up arguing with me about Victorian literature for an hour before realizing her mistake." "You've never told me that story," Clara said. Request, simple yet significant given Clara's usual physical reserve and the medical constraints of recent months, touched Thomas deeply. Without hesitation, he moved to the wide hospital-style bed, carefully positioning himself beside her, on her uninjured side, his arm gently cradling her shoulders as she rested her head against his chest. "Is this all right?" he asked, acutely aware of her still healing body and the potential for discomfort. "More than all right," Clara sighed, relaxing against him with evident contentment. "I've missed this kind of simple physical connection. More than I expected to, actually." Thomas understood completely. Their relationship had developed primarily through intellectual and emotional channels, with physical expression limited to brief kisses and hand-holding due to both circumstance and mutual caution. This quiet intimacy, holding each other without expectation or demand, represented a new dimension of connection, a wordless acknowledgement of both vulnerability and trust. They lay together in comfortable silence, the room gradually darkening as winter evenings settled over Chicago. Thomas felt Clara's breathing slow and deepen as she drifted towards sleep, her body growing heavier against his. The simple, profound trust of her falling asleep in his arms moved him unexpectedly, a tangible expression of the emotional barriers that had gradually dissolved between them. "I should go," he whispered, when he was certain she was fully asleep, carefully beginning to disentangle himself. "Stay," Clara murmured drowsily, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Just a little longer." Thomas settled back beside her, content to remain until she fell into deeper sleep. In the quiet darkness of the borrowed room, surrounded by the temporary arrangements of Clara's extended recovery, he found himself filled with surprising certainty about their shared future. Not the specific form it might take, but its essential reality. Whatever challenges lay ahead, the connection between them had proven resilient enough to withstand distance, medical crises, and the complex integration of past losses with present possibilities. Eventually, Clara's breathing indicated deeper sleep, allowing Thomas to carefully extricate himself and adjust her position with practiced gentleness. He covered her with the quilt, placed a light kiss on her forehead, and moved quietly toward the door. "Thomas," Clara called softly as he reached for the light switch. He turned to find her awake again, her expression serious in the dim illumination. "Thank you for finding me in the garden that morning, for seeing me." The simple acknowledgement, recognizing the pivotal moment that had connected them and the deeper recognition it represented, summarized perfectly the journey they had undertaken together. "Thank you for being there to be found," Thomas replied, "for tending what mattered when I couldn't." No further words were necessary as he dimmed the lights and quietly departed, leaving Clara to healing sleep while carrying with him the certainty of their mutual declaration. Love acknowledged without fanfare but with profound sincerity, a foundation for whatever adaptations their future might require. February 14th, this Valentine's Day, held none of the commercial trappings or grand gestures often associated with the holiday, yet it contained something far more valuable. Simple, truth spoken between two people who have learned, through separate journeys of loss, the precious rarity of genuine connection. Clara and I used words today that we've both been cautious about articulating, not from uncertainty, but from respect for their significance. I love her. She loves me. This knowledge doesn't erase our past loves, but stands alongside them. Different constellations in the same night sky, each with its own pattern and brilliance. April in Vermont arrived with its characteristic unpredictability, days of brilliant sunshine alternating with brief returns to winter, flowering trees bravely blooming. Despite occasional snow flurries, the landscape awakening unevenly from its seasonal dormancy. Thomas moved through final preparations for Clara's homecoming, with matching variations of anticipation and apprehension, checking and rechecking the garden apartment's accessibility features while simultaneously planning which spring plantings would be most visible from her windows. The arrival date had been postponed twice due to medical considerations, first an unexpected infection requiring additional antibiotics, then scheduling complications with her final surgical follow-up. But now, nearly 6 months after the accident that had dramatically altered their careful plans, Clara was finally returning to Vermont, not to her small cottage, which she had reluctantly sold in February, but to the garden apartment in Thomas's Victorian home. "The forecast shows clear skies for Monday," Thomas reported during their Sunday evening video call. "Perfect traveling weather." Clara's image on his laptop screen showed her sitting in what had become a familiar setting, the converted bedroom in David's Chicago home, though now the medical equipment had been removed, and most of her belongings packed into the shipping boxes, visible in the background. "Excellent," she replied. "David and I have reviewed the route to the airport approximately 17 times. You'd think I was embarking on an Antarctic expedition rather than a commercial flight." Thomas smiled at the dry humor that had increasingly characterized Clara's communications as her recovery progressed. "He's been a tremendous support," he acknowledged. "I'm grateful for how he's helped you through these months." "Yes," Clara agreed, her expression softening. "It's been unexpected in many ways, rebuilding a friendship with my ex-husband while recovering from major surgery and maintaining a long-distance relationship with you, not the plot I would have predicted for this chapter of my life." "Life specializes in unexpected plot developments," Thomas observed, "as we've both learned repeatedly." Clara nodded, then glanced away from the camera briefly as someone spoke off-screen. "David wants to know if you have any special instructions for wheelchair management at the Vermont airport," she reported, rolling her eyes slightly at her ex-husband's continued hovering. "Tell him I've arranged everything with airport services," Thomas assured her. "Just as we discussed on our three-way call last week and via email yesterday and by text this morning." Clara laughed, the sound carrying clearly through the digital connection. "I've told him. He says he'll only believe it when he receives confirmation of your safe arrival text tomorrow night. I appreciate his concern, Thomas said sincerely, and I promise to text the moment you're settled in the apartment. Their conversation continued with practical details about flight schedules and final arrangements, but beneath the logistics ran a current of shared excitement about ending their physical separation. The past 6 months had built a relationship founded on intentional communication and mutual support through adversity, but both were more than ready to transition to daily interaction rather than scheduled video calls and occasional visits. "This time tomorrow you'll be home," Thomas said as their call drew to a close. The word home hung between them, its significance acknowledged in Clara's softened expression. "Home," she echoed thoughtfully. "It's been a long time since any place truly felt like that. But yes, I believe I am coming home, not just to Vermont or to the apartment, but to you, to us." The simple declaration, delivered without dramatic emphasis but with evident sincerity, warmed Thomas deeply. "Safe travels, Clara. I'll see you tomorrow." "Until tomorrow," she agreed, raising her fingers to the screen in what had become their customary virtual goodbye gesture. The following day passed in a blur of final preparations and anticipatory checking of flight status updates. Thomas put fresh flowers from the garden in the apartment, ensured the newly installed grab bars in the bathroom were secure, and triple-checked that the refrigerator was stocked with Clara's favorite foods. By mid-afternoon, he found himself with nothing left to prepare but hours still remaining before her flight's arrival, a situation that sent him out to the garden for much-needed distraction. Eleanor's garden, now irrevocably Thomas and Clara's, garden in his mind was awakening with early spring vigor. Daffodils nodded in bright clusters along the stone pathway. Unfurling hostas created fresh green mounds in shaded corners, and the Japanese maple displayed the first delicate red leaves of the season. Thomas moved among these familiar elements, with appreciation for both their beauty and their symbolic timing, new growth emerging just as Clara returned to tend them again. Near the eastern fence, Eleanor's prized roses showed promising buds, including the Remember Me variety Thomas had once pointed out to Clara during their early garden explorations. He checked them carefully, noting with satisfaction that they had weathered the winter well and would likely produce abundant blooms by early summer. Clara would appreciate their resilience, he thought, their ability to regenerate despite harsh conditions, just as she had done throughout her recovery. The afternoon light was beginning to soften toward evening when Thomas finally returned, inside to shower and change before driving to the airport. He moved through the main house, now subtly transformed by the renovations undertaken for Clara's return, with heightened awareness of how spaces reflect and shape relationships. The past year had seen this home transition from a shrine to Eleanor's memory to a place of new possibilities, each room holding both. Curtains tended what mattered to me when I couldn't, helped me find a way forward after profound loss. Quite the partnership we've developed, Clara observed with a small smile, built on mutual rescue. And mutual respect, Thomas added. Don't forget that essential ingredient. The evening settled into comfortable routine, sharing a simple dinner Thomas had prepared in advance, unpacking Clara's most essential belongings, establishing the basic patterns that would structure their new living arrangement. Despite the months of planning and discussion that had preceded this day, both recognized the significance of these first practical negotiations, the tangible expression of theoretical agreements about shared and separate spaces, independence, within proximity, the balance of connection and autonomy that would define their relationship moving forward. As evening deepened toward night, Thomas helped Clara transfer from wheelchair to bed, a process she managed with increasing independence, but still welcomed assistance with after the fatigue of travel. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she looked up at him with an expression that mingled contentment with lingering vulnerability. "Will you stay?" she asked softly. "Just to sleep beside me? I've missed that since Valentine's Day." The simple request, acknowledging both desire for closeness and respect for current limitations, epitomized the thoughtful awareness that characterized their relationship. Without hesitation, Thomas settled beside her on the specially designed bed, careful to position himself where he wouldn't disturb her healing hip. "Is this arrangement working for you?" Clara asked, as they lay together in the darkened room, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. "Sharing your home but maintaining separate spaces, it's rather unconventional for a relationship at our stage of life. Conventional arrangements haven't exactly featured prominently in our story thus far," Thomas observed with gentle humor. "But yes, this feels right for now. Connected but not enmeshed, together but not dependent. We have time to figure out what comes next as your recovery progresses and our relationship continues to evolve." Clara nodded against his shoulder, satisfied with this perspective. "One day at a time," she murmured, sleep beginning to soften her voice. "Like tending a garden. You plan for future blooms but focus on today's needs." "Exactly," Thomas agreed, pressing a light kiss to her hair. "Rest now. Tomorrow we can see the garden properly in morning light." As Clara drifted into sleep beside him, Thomas found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From strangers, connected only by shared understanding of loss, to partners creating a life together, with all its necessary adaptations and unexpected developments. What had begun with Clara secretly tending Eleanor's abandoned garden had evolved into something neither could have anticipated that April morning when Thomas finally opened his curtains. The garden waited outside the apartment windows, Eleanor's original vision now merged with Clara's careful stewardship and Thomas's renewed participation, a living metaphor for how the past could be honored while still creating space for new growth. With spring awakening the Vermont landscape and Clara finally returned to help tend what they now shared, Thomas felt a sense of completion that encompassed rather than erased all that had come before. April 15th. Clara is home. The apartment. Arrangement works well for her current needs, while respecting both our desire for connection and our individual requirements for autonomy. Eleanor's Our Garden awaits Clara's expert attention, though her contributions will necessarily adapt to her physical capabilities during continued recovery. This evolution seems appropriate somehow, all of us learning to tend what matters in new ways, honoring original designs while accommodating inevitable changes. Not the life either of us would have chosen or predicted, perhaps, but one we now embrace with clear-eyed appreciation for its unexpected beauty. End of story. History and potential in delicate balance. The airport arrivals area hummed with the usual activities, emotional reunions, business travelers striding purposefully toward rental car counters, families corralling children and luggage with equal determination. Thomas stood slightly apart from the main flow, watching the gate where Clara's flight had just arrived, his heart beating with a mixture of anticipation and lingering concern about her comfortable transition from plane to wheelchair to car. When she finally appeared, wheeled by an airport attendant but sitting straighter than in previous months, her face brightened immediately upon spotting him. Thomas moved quickly to meet her, noting with pleasure that she wore the silver necklace he had given her for her birthday, the garden trowel and book charms visible against her blue traveling clothes. "Welcome home," he said simply, leaning down to kiss her with more demonstrativeness than their usually reserved public interactions. Clara received both the kiss and the greeting with evident pleasure. "It feels like home already," she replied, glancing around the small Vermont airport with the appreciative eye of someone returning to a beloved landscape after long absence. The journey from airport to house passed in comfortable conversation, Clara reporting on her final medical clearances, Thomas updating her on university happenings and garden developments. As they approached the familiar Victorian structure, now illuminated by early evening light, Clara fell silent, her expression turning contemplative. "Having second thoughts?" Thomas asked gently, recognizing the mixture of emotions such a transition might evoke. "Not second thoughts," Clara clarified, "just absorbing the significance. This is a major life change, Thomas, moving into your home, even with the separate apartment arrangement, beginning this new chapter together." "A significant step," Thomas agreed, pulling into the driveway, "but one I believe we're ready for after everything we've navigated these past months." Clara nodded, her expression clearing into certainty. "I agree. Just needed a moment to acknowledge the threshold we're crossing." Thomas appreciated this characteristic thoughtfulness, Clara's habit of marking important transitions with conscious awareness rather than rushing past their significance. It was one of the many qualities he had come to love in her during their months of separated connection. The garden apartment entrance had been modified with a gently sloping ramp disguised as a decorative pathway, Clara's design suggestion that maintained accessibility without institutional appearance. Thomas wheeled her along this path, opened the newly widened door, and guided her into what would now be her space for at least the coming months. Clara took in the apartment with evident emotion, noting the familiar furniture from her cottage, arranged thoughtfully in the open-plan living area, the fresh flowers from the garden placed in her own vases, the wall of windows looking out on the garden she had once tended secretly and would soon help nurture again. Everything had been positioned for both accessibility and aesthetic appeal, respecting both her physical needs and her designer's eye for balanced composition. "It's perfect," she said softly, reaching for Thomas's hand. "You've thought of everything." "I had excellent guidance," Thomas replied, squeezing her fingers lightly, "from both your specific instructions and my general understanding of what matters to you." They moved through the apartment together, Clara noting with approval the various accessibility modifications that would support her continuing recovery while maintaining the space's original charm. The bathroom with its strategically placed grab bars and wheel-under sink, the kitchen with adjusted counter heights, the bedroom with its special mattress system recommended by her physical therapist, each element represented thoughtful consideration of her needs without defining the space primarily by disability. "I can be independent here," Clara observed, satisfaction evident in her tone. "While still being connected to you, to the garden, it's exactly the balance I hoped for." "That was the goal," Thomas confirmed. "Supporting your recovery without compromising your autonomy." Clara turned her wheelchair to face him directly, her expression serious. "Thank you, Thomas. Not just for this," she gestured at the carefully prepared apartment, "but for everything these past months, for not giving up when I tried to push you away after the accident, for maintaining connection across distance and medical complications, for seeing me as whole even when I felt most broken." The acknowledgement, delivered with characteristic directness but unusual emotional openness, touched Thomas deeply. "You've done the same for me," he reminded her gently. "Seen me when I was hidden behind closed